and welcome to this video, Family History Research, Data Organisation, Layout and Usage. I'm Gary Jones, and I'd just like to start by making sure it's clear what this video is and isn't about. So this isn't a general introduction to researching your family history. There are plenty of books and plenty of videos, including on YouTube, out there. I don't think I can really add much to that. What this is about is I've been researching my family history for 28 years now and writing my family history, and over the years I've tried a number of things like configuring my family history software and how I've organised my files on disk, how I've handled locations so I can see specific addresses. I've tried a number of things over the years that have really helped me with my family history research to be much more efficient, to be much more in control and understanding what records I've got for a particular person and which gaps I still need to fill. And it's really helped me, particularly with the family history software, configure it in a way that I now feel it's helping me, because we all spend an awful lot of time typing our data into family history software, and then you think, right, how do I get to it again? You know, I've got that little tab there that shows me some of the information. I can run a report, I can produce a diagram or run a query, or I can click on another tab and I know the data's in there somewhere. But I've managed to come up with a way of trying to get as much as that data, really useful data, on my display as possible in a way that really helps me understand where I am with my research. Okay. The important thing about my videos is they're not videos telling you how you should do things. The complete opposite, in fact. I appreciate everyone's different. Everyone has their own way of doing things. When it comes to choosing a piece of family history software, you will have your own favourites and ones that really you like and ones that you don't like. I use a particular piece of software for demonstration in this video, but everything I demonstrate I believe you can do in all family history software, so it's not specific to anything. And this is very much me saying, these are the sorts of things that I've tried which you might find useful, or at least if you don't want to use them directly the way that I've done it, you might get some ideas on other things that you could go away and do. So it's very much that. So it's not me telling you what to do, it's me telling you what I've done, and hopefully it will give you some useful ideas on how you can also improve your family history research. Okay. So I'm going to now go through the video structure. This is the introduction. Then the first section is data storage and structure, where I talk about file naming conventions and directory structures that I've used, again just to give you some ideas. But I also talk about the benefits that I've seen from downloading source records. So some people will have links to source records on various family history websites, but there are real benefits to downloading those records as well, and that section shows you what they are. Next section is layout and customization, which I have to say I think is probably the most important one, and this is how I have laid out my family history software, and it's really helped me. And in order to do that, I've used custom facts, date phrases, and sometimes some program specific functionality. All that will make sense when you see that section. 4 is locations, and this is where I personally like to plot and locations down to street level. I like to know as much about where my ancestors lived, not just a place, which most family history software will plot for you, but I like to be able to work out right the way down to the street, and if possible using directories even the building where my ancestors lived. And there are various reasons which I explain why that proves to be useful. Okay, so that section is about how I've personally combined address and place fields in GEDCOM to produce what I've called a location, just my own terminology. How I then set about manually geocoding them, how I set about finding those locations on old maps and things, because a lot of them don't exist anymore. And then, as I explained to you, the benefits of it, and there are some real benefits from it. The next section is more research aids, which, as its name implies, is a bit of a catch-all, where there were a few things that didn't quite fit in the previous sections, but I wanted to bring them to your attention anyway because they're useful. So first is surname distribution analysis, and this is both useful in terms of researching your family history, and also can provide some good data, some interesting data to put into your family history when you come to write it. It tells you how you go about gathering the surname distribution data, and then what you can do with it and why it's useful. Next one is possible matches, which is a very short thing on how I personally handle possible matches. And what I mean by that is where you've got an individual that you might have seen in someone else's tree, you put them into your tree, but at the moment they're very much an uncertain match, you don't know any facts about them, and you want to indicate that this is a possible match and that you haven't yet ascertained whether the person really belongs in your tree or not. I personally find that lots of family history software doesn't cover that very well, so this is what I've done. And then finally, which is almost bookends, because I started in data storage and structure section 2 talking about the advantages of downloading data. In this section I also talk about the advantages of linking back to data sources, and if you combine the two you really do get the best of both worlds. And then the last section is final thoughts, where I kind of bring everything together so you can see exactly how all these things help join together and help you be more efficient in your family history research, and really also help you when you come to write your family history as well. It gives you quite a few steers on things to include. Okay, this video, I admit, is quite long. When I first had the idea for this video some weeks back, I had just a few ideas that I thought would be useful to feedback, but as I started to kind of plan it and structure it and then to produce it, I realised there was actually quite a lot of material I wanted to include. So whilst there are 6 sections, some of them have been divided into subsections to try and make them more manageable. In the timeline on YouTube you'll see that all the subsections have been listed into, I think they call them chapters as well, split into chapters. In terms of viewing, if you're intending to view the whole video, then obviously do it in the order it's been filmed. If you're only interested in dipping into 1 or 2 sections, then that's fine. Each section has been designed to be self-contained, and you can watch one section without having to watch the previous one. It should still make sense. But the sections themselves, when they've been broken into subsections, I wouldn't advise jumping around the subsections, because a section has been designed from start to finish to logically flow. So we do this, we do this, we do this. And I think if you jump around subsections you might get a little confused. So by all means dip in and out of sections, but if you're going to watch, say, section 3, I would watch it from the beginning all the way through. I wouldn't jump around too much. Okay, just very quickly a little bit about myself. I've been researching my family history for 28 years. I'm an amateur. I'm a very keen amateur, experienced amateur, but I'm not a professional. I'm not qualified, and I don't do it for a living. And I think that's useful because this video is all about a keen amateur like myself and all the things I've tried over the years, some of which I've abandoned because they just didn't give me the results I hoped they would. Others which were okay, but probably weren't worth the effort, and sometimes I did that and it worked extremely well. And all this in this video today is about me feeding back all the things that I've really found beneficial. Okay, so just a final reminder that this video is very much, this is what I've done. Have a think about what you could do, and it's not me telling you that this is what you should do, okay? And if you come out of this video at the end of it even with just a few new ideas on things you could do, then I'll be delighted. It means all my efforts have paid off, and it means the time that you've invested watching this video has proved fruitful as well, which is great. Okay, so that's the introduction. So the next section is data storage and structure. So this section is about data storage and structure, and what it's primarily about is how downloading files to my PC has been very beneficial. So it's about why you would want to consider, if you don't already, downloading files to your PC, because there are some definite benefits in doing so, and that's what this section is about. I just wanted to start very briefly by saying that the typical scenarios on where people have their data stored. In the first one, it's the cloud. So these days it is possible, if you take up a subscription with a website like, for example, Ancestry, it could be Find My Past, The Genealogist, or MyHeritage, or any of the other family history websites, that if you take up a subscription with them, it's possible for you to then directly enter your family history data straight into that website. So you don't have to purchase any family history software for your PC or your Mac or whatever. You can enter it straight into the cloud. So that's what I mean by cloud. The next one is kind of, to some extent, the opposite, which is where you have some family history software on your PC and you enter all your data on the PC, and that's where your master copy is. It's where you perform all the updates, it's where you enter all the data and edit it. You can, if you want, and many people choose to, including myself, upload a copy every now and then to a website to benefit from things like internet data matching functionality, which will give you matches and compare your tree to other people's trees, and it can be very useful. But primarily your master data is on the PC. Then there's what I've called duplicated, which is where you have a copy of your data on your PC, in the cloud on a website like Ancestry, and maybe on another device like a laptop, which you might take with you to record offices or something. And it makes use of the functionality, synchronization functionality, which means wherever you make an update, it will sync with the other copies of your database, and therefore you're confident you've always got an up-to-date copy on your PC, cloud, and any other devices. There are advantages and disadvantages to these different approaches. I'm not really going to go into those here, but this is all leading up to why have I found it beneficial to download files, particularly source files. So you've got your basic family history data, which is where you've typed in so-and-so was born on such and such a date, but the source file will be a parish record or a census return or something, and it's particularly downloading those source files why I've found benefit to do so. So I've listed here a number of reasons why you might want to consider downloading. None of them are killer reasons in their own right, but I will show you later what I've done and how I've benefited it from doing it. So the first two bullet points are really to do with continued access to your data. So if you're mainly the kind of cloud-based approach where you've got your family tree on a particular website, one of the things to consider is that my understanding is that if you don't pay your subscription anymore, you can still access your family tree, i.e. the basic records that you've typed in, but you can no longer access any of the source data because you need a subscription for that. Whereas if you downloaded that source data, then it wouldn't matter if you didn't continue with the subscription to that website. And the second one follows on from this, which is where I've seen people's family trees which have been uploaded to Ancestry, where I found a useful match, and when I've clicked on to see what the source data was, it was actually a link to the record on Ancestry. Now, the danger if you don't download those records is that you're becoming tied in to a particular provider, because if all your source records are actually links to records on that provider's website, I don't know the answer to this question, but how easy would it be if one day you decided, I've been subscribing to Ancestry for 2 or 3 years, I quite fancy stopping that now and trying another website, Find My Past or MyHeritage, because I've heard good things about them, or they've got records that Ancestry don't have. because all of the major websites have a lot of the same data, indexes of birth, marriages and deaths, the census returns, etc. But they also have unique records to them. And it may just be that you think, I'll give it Ancestry a rest for now and I'll try another website. But if all your family tree is on Ancestry and all your records are links to records on Ancestry, as I say, I don't know the answer to this question. How easy is it to then move your family tree and all your source records to another website? Again, if you downloaded all your source records, that wouldn't be so much of a issue. I understand it's possible, very easy, to download your family tree from one of these websites as a GEDCOM file, which you can then import into another website. But what I don't know is how easy it is to do the links to the records. So again, it's just something to consider. If you're someone who thinks, I'm happy with the particular website I use, I don't imagine I'll ever stop subscribing to it, I doubt if I'll ever move to another one, then it's clearly not an issue. But it's just something to be aware of, because it could limit the flexibility of trying other websites if you wanted to. The next 2 points are more to do with the records themselves, how legible they are, how easy they are to read, and also how easy is it to locate a particular entry in a record that contains multiple entries. So the first one is, if you're using the approach which is where all your source records are links to records on a website, I have noticed, because I've subscribed to a number of websites over the years, that whilst in general the quality of the images is very good, every now and then you'll find that on one particular website you look at a census image or something and it's not very readable. It's maybe not contrast enough, the writing's very faint, it might even be slightly out of focus or whatever. Whereas you look at the identical record on another website, if it's available, and clearly if it's something like censuses they are, and you find that their scan is much, much better. Now, if you only rely on links to a particular website and you come across an image which isn't very good, unless you download it and do something with that image, you're rather stuck with that poor quality image. And on a similar vein, some records, and I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute to illustrate why I found it useful to download them and do something with them. Some records contain multiple entries, and if you rely again on just the links to the website, if you ever need to go back and look at records, and there are good reasons why you will want to do that, it means every time you look at that record, you've then got to search for the person. And if it's got lots and lots of entries, you have to go down each time you look at that record. And whilst you might think, well, you're only talking maybe a minute or two, if you've got hundreds of people in your family tree, and therefore thousands of records for them, you'll be surprised how often you have to go back and look at a record. And if there was some way of identifying the person or the entry much more quickly, you would save more time. And remember, the purpose of this video is all about how you improve your efficiency and you avoid wasting time and doing things over and over again that you don't need to. So the last one is to do with writing your family history. That if you've actually downloaded the images, you can then, if you want, include them in your family history when you come to write your family history. Now, I'm not going to go into a great deal more detail about that in this video. I've got another video on writing your family history, and I go into a lot of detail, a lot of examples about how you want to use different sources and import them into your family history to add to your story that you're writing. But it's something else. If all your sources again are just links to a website, how are you then going to easily include them in your family history? Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll show you a couple of examples of why I found it useful to download images. Okay, so the first one is, you may recognise it, is a page from the National Identity Register. As you can see, it's got quite a few entries on it. This particular example I've chosen is also a little faint, not too bad, considering some records we look at where the legibility is very poor. This isn't too bad, but it's a little faint. Anyway, what I wanted to show you here was, as you can see, there's lots of records on there, and if you just have a link to that, every time you look at it, whenever you go back to revisit it, you'd have to search for the family again and use oh, there they are. Okay. You'd also have to put up with the fact that the legibility is okay, nothing special, and it's also slightly wonky, which is just an aesthetics thing. So this is what I did. I've edited it, and I don't know if you can immediately see, but the contrast has been improved, and now the writing is darker. I'll show you the two compared in a minute, one above the other, and you can see it's not dramatically improved because the original wasn't too bad, but I was able, because I downloaded it, edit it very simply just by changing levels and contrast. Took me a few seconds. I managed to get it looking much more readable. But by far the most important thing, the thing I really want to talk about here, is if you look, I'll zoom in on this in a minute so you'll be able to get a clearer view, but I just want you to look at the page. Can you see in the bottom left hand corner on the side, I've put a red bar. Now that means that your eyes can go straight to the record of interest. I've used a bar in this case. You can use all sorts of highlighting. You can use dots, you can use arrows, you can draw a box round, you can highlight it as if you were highlighting it with a pen. The bar is particularly useful with this sort of record and with censuses because it not only shows you where the household is, but you can also make the bar the link for the household. So you can immediately get an idea by looking at that quite pictorial view that the bar is, there's about 4 or 5 people in the household. Okay. Oh, if we zoom in just to see a little bit clearer, you can just see again it's slightly more legible, and I've straightened it, but that's aesthetics, and you can see the red bar, which means I can immediately now, every time I bring up this record, I don't have to keep searching for the people. I can immediately, my eyes will go straight to that red bar, and as I say, it's amazing if you're spending a day doing some research and you're revisiting records for any reason. The fact that you can quickly bring them up and immediately go to the record and say, no, there's no, whatever, it really does save time. And if you want proof of that, the next one, if I bring up the next example, this is from a parish register. It's around, I think it's 1802 to 1804, something like that. Now this is actually quite a good example. If you've looked at old parish registers, you'll know that some of them are very difficult to read, nigh on impossible when you go back a long way. The writing's very difficult to read, quite often ink's faded and things. So this is actually quite a reasonable example. So this is one where I haven't had to actually make it more legible, it's quite readable. But the thing that makes it a challenge is, I haven't counted, but what is there? 30 or 40 entries per page, which means on that double page there's about 80 entries, 70 or 80 entries. Now, the first time you bring up that record and you think you've got a match, you're quite excited, you're quite happy to put the effort in to search through it all and find the entry or entries that you're interested in. And then you transcribe them, you type them into your family tree, and you think that's great. If ever you want to look at that record again one day, when it comes back up again, you think, oh, if you've been doing your research for an hour or two and you're already starting to feel a little bit weary, and you bring that up and you think, oh, and you're tired. I've sometimes gone through all the, right down to the bottom, thought, I can't find it. And I've had to go back again and do it, and finally I found it. And then I've checked it, and in the end, the thing I was checking, it didn't have the information I wanted anyway. The reason why you might want to look at a record again, so you might be thinking, well, I don't often have to look at records. Parish registers in particular, I can see why in 1837 they introduced civil registration and tried to get people to record things in a more consistent way. Because parish records can be really frustrating. Depending on who the incumbent was at the time, the amount of detail you find in a parish record really does vary. In this example, it's just the child's name and the parents and the baptism date, about the minimum you can get away with. But I've seen examples where they've also put in the birth date, maybe in a column down the side, which is really useful. I've seen examples where they've put the father's occupation, so it might say daughter of Mary and John Smith, blacksmith, or whatever. And I've also seen examples where they've put the abode where they were living. Sometimes it's not very useful, it just says the name of the parish, but other times it actually might give the name of a farm or the street they lived in. So sometimes when I'm looking at my data and I think, oh, I haven't got that piece of data, I haven't got the date of birth, I wonder if it was in the baptism register and I forgot to make a note of it. And if you have to click on a link and that comes up again, all 80 entries, and you think, oh, I'm not sure I could be bothered, quite honestly, especially if you've had to look through quite a few records. So what I've done, so this is what I've done, and you can see the difference is quite subtle. I haven't changed the legibility because it was quite good, but what I have done, if you look closely, as you can see, there's actually two entries of interest here, and I've highlighted them in pale blue. So I think old parish record registers lends itself to a highlight for a number of reasons. One is that because quite often they cram as many entries in as possible, there's not normally much space, so you can't really draw a bar because there's only one entry and it would probably look like a dot. Also, I find that quite often the handwriting is sloped because they're not using lined paper in these registers. I quite often find handwriting goes all over the place. So even if you put a little red dot, you sometimes start to follow the record across and lose yourself. This lends itself perfectly to highlighting. So you highlight almost, it's the digital equivalent of getting a highlighter pen out and highlighting it. It means your eye not only immediately goes to that record, but then you can very easily scan the record. And it means if I'm thinking, oh, I wonder if it specified the birth date in this particular parish register, baptism register, I can quickly bring up the image, and then my eyes go straight to the highlighted entries and I can say, no, they didn't. That's taken me a few seconds, whereas if I had to bring it up again and search for both those entries over 80, I think I'm not sure I could even be bothered. So as you can see, it's really simple. Sometimes in the previous example I've improved the legibility slightly, straightened it and put the bar in. In this example didn't really need to do much else than the highlighting, but it's not much effort to do this. If you do it as you go along and you download a record, you've located the record on Find My Past or Ancestry. If you just download it, okay, and we'll come on to file names and how you're going to store it in a minute, but if you download it and you've got it, you can then improve the legibility, you can straighten it, you can put some sort of highlight in, and the next time you go to look at some records, you can find things just like that. And believe me, when you've got hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of records, it really starts to save time and it starts to save your weariness as well. Okay, so that moves on nicely to file naming. If you're now downloading all these files and you've got to put them somewhere and you've got to name them, because if ever you've downloaded records from the website, most of the time the file name is pretty meaningless. It clearly means something to the website, but for you it will have numbers and letters in it and everything, and it won't mean anything at all. So you'll want to rename it to something that means something, something which is a unique name for that record, a unique file name. So, but also something that means something, and you can immediately look at it and know what that record is. Now, what I'm going to show you is what I've done. It's the file naming convention I've come up with. And as I always say about my videos, this is me feeding back to you what I've done. I appreciate that everyone else is different. We all learn in different ways, we all like to do things differently, and in the case of file naming, it's what works for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 3 or 4 screens of examples which build up in complexity of record type. I'm not going to show you every single type, and I'm not going to show you all the records because that would be quite tedious, but I'm going to show you hopefully a sufficient number that you start to see how I've done things. Okay, so the first one is Dines George 1894 birth. Now, 2 things to note. One is I got .jpeg, that's just for illustration purposes. I tend to save my files in JPEG. If you prefer TIFF or anything else, that's fine. So this is just an example. And also you notice that I start with the surname in uppercase. I quite like that. I know some people really don't like it. I personally like it because surname is one of the major keys that I sort data on. So it's a thing. If you don't like the uppercase, don't worry about it. But say, concentrate more on the idea rather than whether you particularly like surnames in uppercase or what. So, Dines George, 1894 birth. That's really all you need. There might be more than one Dines George, which is why I put the birth year, and I put birth, so I immediately know it's a birth record. The next example is a baptism, so I've got Dines George 1894 baptism, and then I've got an example, Short William Henry 1857 baptism 1863. So those are the two different examples, one where the baptism has occurred in the same year as birth, so I haven't put the birth year, the baptism year, and the second one, which is where the child is baptised a few years later. You could even have examples of adult baptism. This is an example of where I think, if I was starting again today, I do things slightly differently. I would put the year of baptism after the word baptism, even if it was the same as birth, just to differentiate between. It's a kind of positive confirmation thing. What if you were in the middle of typing Dines George 1894 baptism and the doorbell went, and when you came back you forgot to add the year? So I think if I was starting again from scratch, I would probably always put the baptism year, even if it happens to be the same year. It's a matter of taste. Next one, Dines George 1894 death, 1881. Not much more to say about that. Dines George 1894 burial, 1961. 99.9% of burials will occur in the same year as death. The only example I can think of, well, I can think of two examples. One is where someone dies on the very last day of December, so they're buried the following January. And the other one is a more gruesome one, unfortunately, which is when sometimes coroners get involved and they can't release the body for a while. But hopefully you won't get too many of those. So the next one is census. This is obviously quite a major one. Dines George 1894 census, and then clearly you're going to need the census year, which in this case is 1901. Sometimes you'll find in censuses that the enumerator has started listing a family towards the bottom of a page, and if you go to the next page the family carries on. So the next example is where to cater for that, which is where you've got Short William Henry 1857 census 1891 -1, and then the following line is -2, and that shows me that it's one of those ones that runs over the page. You could also use that, I haven't, for if you wanted to download everybody from, say, an institution, from, say, a workhouse in 1851 or something. It might run to 15 pages. You could use the same thing, -1, -2, all the way down to -15. Next one, National Identity Register, which I've already introduced you to. Dines George 1894 National Identity Register, 1939. You don't really need to put that because there's only one National Identity Register, but I like to put it because it just reminds me of the year. And you'll notice here I've got a transcript which I've saved as a PDF, and I've got the image which I've saved as a JPEG. Find My Pass, which I also have a subscription to, make it very easy for you to print out quite a nice transcript and the image. So again, this is out of choice. You might just want to save the transcript, you might just want to save the image. Right, the next screen is continuing on, Dines George 1894 National Probate Register. Now the National Probate Register, if you don't know it, is basically an index of wills. It's called a calendar of wills, and it's very useful because it contains quite a lot of information. It gives the person's name, it gives the death date, it gives you where they died, it gives you the date of probate, it gives you their estate value, it tells you how much their estate was valued at the time of death. And I think it also gives the name of the executor. And this is all free. You can. This is available online, and and you don't have to order a copy of the will in order to get that information. All that information is in the index. So these are the index records. You can subsequently order the will, and I'll come on to wills in a minute. But you can have. I've got two examples here: NPR probate, where there was a will, and it gives the probate year 1962. And the other one is where it was an administration where there wasn't a will, 1949. Next one is a school one. Now this is Dynes George 1894 school, then I give the year of the record, and then I give the school, Beulah Junior School in this example. This has worked for me thus far. I could imagine an example where you would need to maybe put more information, possibly whether it was admission or whether it was leaving. Because, for example, if it's a child that's moved around quite a few times in their education, because maybe to do with their parents' work, maybe their father's in the army or something, it may well be that they join the school in the February of the year and then leave in the October to move yet again to another school. In which case, you could very simply just put hyphen admission or hyphen departure. I haven't had that, but I could see it could be a possible extension. The next one is the will I've referred to, Dynes George 1894, will 1957. I've got JPEG or PDF. I just wanted to mention this one because the 1957 here that I put down is the date of the will. Some people put down the date of the will being read, i.e. the probate date. It doesn't really matter, as long as you know what you mean by it and you're consistent, you don't swap between the two. I like to put it down because I like to list chronologically all my facts and see that they created a will 5 years before they actually died, sort of thing, rather than the will date always being the date when it was actually read. I've got JPEG or PDF. Some wills are a little bit disappointing when you order them. They say no more than I leave everything I own to my beloved wife, so they don't tell you much. I've got other wills that are 5 or 6 pages and have a wealth of information in. They can be really good sources of information, or sometimes you can be a little bit disappointed when you order them. So if it runs to many pages, rather than have them stored as separate images, I combine them into one PDF. It's just my preference. Right, the next one is military. Now military I've tweaked a few times over the years. It can be quite complicated. As you can see, I've got here Dynes George 1894. Then I put down the service. So I put down Army, RAF or Navy. Also I then put a second tag. Because there are so many records associated with the First World War and an increasing number associated with World War II, because so many people fought and died in them, I also have those tags. If they're not there and it says Army and goes straight in, then I know it's not World War I, it's not World War II, it's some other army service. I then put down the record type, so in this case it's World War I pensions, ledgers and index card, but you could have medal cards, you could have service records that can run to 15 to 20 pages. Okay, and then I put down the year of the record. This has worked for me so far. Of all the military records I have, this I've managed to fit it into this convention. Maybe one day something will come along and I'll have to tweak it again, but at the moment it's working. Next one is newspapers. So Dynes George 1894 newspaper. I like to put a brief description, just 2 or 3 words of what the article is about. So in this case it's a court appearance. Then I've put Essex Standard, 29th of April 1931, page 7. I know that sounds dangerously getting close to a citation, but would you believe I've actually had one example where the same individual appeared in the same issue of the same newspaper in 2 different places, and I had to go down to this level. Last page now, you'll be pleased to learn. As you see, I haven't mentioned marriages. Now, I slightly break my convention here, because you'll see I put the word marriage first. The reason I do that is because if I put marriage at the end, and I just saw that the record began Dynes George 1894, when I sort them in order, it might just look like yet another record for George, whereas this is actually a record relating to 2 people. And I've put marriage at the beginning. You could have 2 entries, one indexed for starting with Dynes George. You could then have one for his wife, Brown Mary, marrying Dynes George, like that. I just chose to have the one record and beginning with the word marriage, so I can immediately see this as a marriage and it involved more than one person. So I've got Dynes George 1894 hyphen Brown Mary 1896 or whatever it is. I've got my glasses on. Hyphen 1914. So that's my convention and it works and I'm consistent with it, but I can understand if you might want to tweak that or put marriage at the end, whatever. The important thing is you're consistent. So that brings me on to how do I handle records for married women. So in this case, he's married Mary Brown, 1896. So up until the point she gets married, as you can see, I've just put Brown Mary 1896 birth. So I handle single women exactly the same as I handle married men. Once they marry, obviously the records will then be indexed under the married name. So what I do here is I've got Brown, brackets M for married, Dimes, Mary 1896, death 1969. So I know that it will still be indexed under Brown for Mary, but I now know that because I've got the brackets M married name, that's the name I will need to look for if ever I want to look up this record again. Okay, and that's it pretty much. I mean, I have got other categories which I'll tell you about. You can see up there yourself, which I've got tags for, and I create. But I think I've probably given you enough examples so you've got an idea of the convention. But you can see there's all sorts of, I mean, freedom of city and poor law removal and settlement, criminal. There's all sorts of other records there that you can see that I've included. But I think that's probably enough for you to get a flavour for how I have come up with my own file naming convention. That's the important thing. This is my own. This is what works for me, and this is what I've evolved over a number of years. I've got to the point where this works for me. The important thing about this section was to get you to think about what file naming convention would work for you, and the fact that you need one, because as your family tree grows and you get hundreds of people and therefore hundreds if not thousands of records, and if you are downloading them and you need to store them away, you do need a file naming convention. If you've already got one, that's fine. If you've got one but you think it needs tweaking, then hopefully this has helped a bit. If you're only starting out and you haven't even really thought about this, the sooner you do this, the better. You will thank yourself for doing this sooner rather than later. Because over the years, I've tried different things, and sometimes I've abandoned them. Sometimes I've had to then come up with something new and change all the file names again and everything. And I've now got to the point where this works. But this was trial and error over a number of years. So anyway, that's file naming. So the next thing is, you've now got all these files. How do you just structure them? How do you structure them on your device? I'm going to talk about a PC, but it applies to Macs, it applies to laptops and everything else. How are you going to structure these in a way that it makes sense to you and you can find where they are on disk? So I'm going to show you. There's two up there, but I'll mention the third. One is, you could decide just to create a directory called data or whatever and put all of your files in one great big flat file structure. The reason why I think you might regret doing that is because once, as I say, you've been tracing your family history for any length of time and you're now getting up to hundreds of people, it's very easy to get up to thousands, but hundreds of people. Each one will have a few records associated with them, and you could get up to many hundreds, if not thousands, of records. Would you really want a directory when you look at it, it's got thousands of entries? I think many people would find that unmanageable, difficult to get their heads around. But it's a possibility. The alternative, there are two other ways that I've identified. The first one is, which is where you come up with a directory structure based on record type, which is pretty much going back to the file naming convention where I came up with the tags on burial, birth, census, etc. And what I do, so the top one is what I do, I group all my records by record type. So I have a directory for birth and all the births go in there. I have burial and all the burials, etc. for all the different record types. The other approach, and this is a common one I've seen amongst some of my fellow genealogists, is they just create a directory for each surname that they're researching. I actually started off with the surname approach many years ago, but the problem is surnames, as you go back and and discover more and more, your number of surnames increases. I've currently got just over 600 surnames in my family tree. Now some of those are just one person, someone who's probably married into the family, and that's all I know about them. I know their maiden name or something or whatever, but I don't know anything else about them. So if I had a directory for them, there'd just be the one person in there with 1 or 2 records. Some of them will have lots of people in them. So if you compare the two approaches, the top one, where you do it by record type, has the advantage that there aren't that many record types. I've only got currently about 25 to 30 that I've identified. That might grow over the years to say 40, but it's not going to grow to hundreds. But it means you have not too many directories, but potentially under some of those directories, for example the census directory, you could end up with hundreds if not thousands of records. The bottom one is you potentially have a lot more directories because there could be hundreds of surnames, but then the directories themselves contain fewer files. Okay, I've gone for the top one. I've got about 25 directories, and under there I've got some, like the census one, as I say, which can contain a lot of records. You could, if you wanted to, if you found it unmanageable, then have subdirectories for each census year, if you really wanted to make it smaller. I haven't bothered doing that, but you could. But it's really whatever out of those two appeals to you. You could either go for, say, for the full flat one where you just put everything in a huge directory, or you go for the record types where there's few directories but quite a lot of files in each directory, or you go for the surnames where there's lots of directories but not so many files in the directories. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this section, and the thrust of this section was all about why is it a good idea, and why would you want to download records, particularly source file records, to your computer? What the benefits of doing that, and then how would you name them, and then what sort of directory structure you would have. So in summary, I started by saying why copy data to PC. I talked about the fact that some people have a cloud-based approach, some people have mainly PC, and some people have the more kind of duplicated with synchronization. I talked about the reasons why you might want to. I listed the reasons about future accessibility in terms of being tied into a particular website, and the fact you'd have to maintain a subscription and all your links are to that website. I then talked about legibility of records, and again, if you don't download, some of the files might not be that very legible or easy to read. I then talked about the fact that some records contain a lot of entries, and again, if you hadn't downloaded it, you've only got a link to it, it means every time you look at it, you've got to try and locate that entry over and over again, whereas if you download it, you can edit it, make it more legible, and put some sort of highlighting in to indicate where the record is. So it means every time in future you look at it, it's easier to locate and easier to read. And then I talked about, very briefly, that the downloaded images could then be included in your family history if you come to write that. And I said, referred you to my other video which goes into a lot more detail about that. Then I said about file naming. So I showed you the file naming convention that I came up with, and said very much these are my ideas that work for me, think about what works for you. Then finally we looked at a directory structure where the two most common ones I've seen are where you group them by record type or where you group them by surname. Okay, so the next section is layout and customization. So this section is layout and customization. I want to start by just setting some background to why I did the things that I'm going to talk about in this section. I've been tracing my family history for 28 years now, so I'm old enough and experienced enough to remember the days when we used to have to travel to record offices. I remember going to St Catherine's House to look at the births, marriages and deaths indexes, and I was going to talk a little bit more detail about when I used to go to the Public Record Office in Chancery Lane to look at census returns. Now, for those of you who remembered making such trips, in order to get the most out of the day, you had to be very well prepared. You couldn't just turn up and think, right, what shall I do now? You had to go there with a list of all the records that you were going to try and locate. You probably had little tables of things so you could tick off the records as you look for them. In short, you had to be well prepared in order to get the most out of your trip. You're going all the way to London for the day and you want to make the most of it. Now, what I used to do when I was looking at census returns was I used to produce in Microsoft Word a table with the list of the individuals in the household, and across the top would be all the different census years. And then even before I went there, I would do some preliminary research just to put across in each of those areas where I knew I didn't need to look for the record. So for example, it could be that particular person wasn't born for that particular census, or a particular person had already died for that particular census, or it might be that we know that the family were no longer living in that area and maybe they've even emigrated or something. And then once I got to the record office and I was then finding out which microfilm I needed, load it onto the microphone reader, go all the way through looking for an entry, and if I managed to find an entry for each person that I'd located, I'd put a tick in the box. If at the end of the day of searching I couldn't find any records for that particular census year for that person, I'd put a question mark to indicate that I have tried looking for it but couldn't find it. And if I didn't get around to looking for a particular entry, I just left it blank. Consequently, when I came home and I could type that information in, I had a record, a nice little table of all the census returns for that particular group of people, and I could see which gaps I still had to look for, which records I'd already located, which records I didn't need to locate because they were the X's, and which records I'd had to look for but couldn't find. Now, what I tell you all this because when all the digitised records came along, and we were able, from the comfort of our own home, to search so many records in an hour, which would have taken you weeks of visiting record offices. I think it's fantastic. I'm not saying I want to go back to the old days. But what I found was that I became less organised because it was so much easier. You could just bring up a website, type searches and locate all sorts of records so quickly, almost without having to think about it, without having to plan. And one of the consequences is I find nowadays I use a particular family tree software package, and I find it very difficult, even though I know I've typed this wealth of data into the database, I find it very difficult to get a clear picture of where I am with my research for a particular person. I know the data's in there somewhere, but I have to run a report or click on a tab or do something to locate the information. Whereas in the old days, I just look at that piece of paper and I could instantly get a view for the census situation for an entire family. So over the years, I've been experimenting with the use of things like custom facts, I'll go into more detail later, date phrases, and particularly the layout of the particular family history package that I use, to try and get to the point where I could very quickly, for one individual, just bring that individual up and have a really good idea of where I was in terms of researching that person. So what this section is about how I have used my family history software to try and help me be much more efficient at understanding what information I've got about an individual. I particularly like pictorial clues, so you'll see that the way I've laid things out instantly tells me where I am with all the records that I could possibly locate about that person. Okay, so I'm going to show you examples of the family history software that I use. The important thing is not to worry too much if you don't use the same package. I was a Family Tree Maker user for many years, all the way from version 1, which I think came on a single floppy, right the way up to a couple of years ago. So I'm well versed in Family Tree Maker and I know what it can do, and I know you can do what I've done in this other package in that, and I'm sure you can do the same in other family history software. So don't worry too much about the fact that, oh, this isn't the software that I use, or that's not the way I have it laid out, or that's not the colour scheme, or whatever. Again, think of the ideas, the concepts, the thought process that I've gone through, and why I've done the things I've done, and how they've helped me become more efficient, both in my family history research, and also how it's really helped me when I've come to write my family history. So the software I moved to is called Family Historian. I won't bore you with the details of why I moved. I haven't regretted the move. It's, again, we're all different, in the same way that when you go to a house, you're buying a house, and for some reason you really like it but your partner doesn't, or vice versa. Sometimes it's you can't put into words why you like something and why you don't, but I'm sure you've all tried different family history software and you found one that you really like, and for some reason you don't like the others. So it doesn't matter which family tree software you're using. Just look at what the principles of what I've done and the ideas behind it. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by showing you a screenshot of how I've configured Family Historian. This is not a guide to genealogical software. It's not a guide to Family Historian. I'm just going to very briefly go through this, very briefly, so you understand that when I concentrate on a particular area of the screen, you understand where it fits into the context of all the other parts of the screen. So the first thing I'll show you is called the records window. Again, don't worry about the terminology. It's called different things in your package, I understand, but I'm sure you'll see an equivalent in your package for everything I'm showing you. So the records window is just really a list of things. So I've got it on the surname index, which you get in all packages, so you can immediately find a particular individual and then select their records. But it also has other tabs for sources, for media records, etc. So that's where you kind of find lists of things. Then moving across, you've got the focus window, which, as you can see, has the person you selected, their spouse, list of any children they may have, it tells you their parents. Across the top it has various photos that you might have imported for the person, and it's where you tend to go to start, and then you might say add a child, and then we go to another window which I'm going to spend more time on in a moment, where you enter all the real details. Moving down to the bottom left, this is an area of the screen that I use for a whole load of different reasons. I've currently got on display the map window, but I use that area for other things like showing all the media associated with an individual, and when I run reports and queries, the output I also allocate to that particular area. Moving across, this is a floating window. This is the citation window, and this is when you're entering the source information for a fact. This window pops up, and at the moment there's a number of tabs. I'm not showing the main tab, I'm showing at the moment the media tab, and I think that's an example of the marriage certificate for these people I've currently got selected. Then we move to the area that we're going to concentrate on most. I know there's an equivalent area in Family Tree Maker, and I'm pretty sure there'll be an equivalent area in all software. Again, this is called the property box, but don't worry about the terminology. It's where you can choose to display all the different facts about a person that you're interested in. Obviously, the more you allocate, the more you're going to have to scroll up and down to see them all. But what I've tried to do with the property box is put as much information on there, and using custom facts, which I'll come on to in a moment, and other things like date phrases, it's allowed me to almost, just by looking at the property box, get a pretty good view, almost a full view, of all the facts I know about that person, with a few extra things that I've put in there, custom facts. And when I come to write the family history, just by looking at the property box for an individual, I can already see the outline for what I'm going to write about them. And it's just taken me a couple of years to tailor this, to add the right set of custom facts, to experiment with date phrases, and to experiment about the layout and everything of the property box. But it's not an exaggeration to say it has revolutionised my research. For the first time, going back to the days when I used to have a Microsoft Word table and I could see pictorially where the gaps were, for the first time I can see pictorially now where the gaps are. Okay, so we're going to be spending time on the property box. So that's the overall view of family history, and you don't really need to know much more about family history. So what I'm now going to do is bring up the property box, and I want to go through certain fields. Some of them you'll recognise as standard GEDCOM fields, like birth and baptism. But I also want to highlight some of the custom facts, and also just the way that I've laid things out. So the first of my custom fields is a to-do field. Now, I know most family history software has research information that you can type in and you can run reports and get lists. The reason I added this, so this is a custom field, is because it allows me, when I select an individual, to instantly see at the top if I've got any outstanding to-do items for that person. I've also produced a custom query, which you can do in family history, where if I want to, I can run a query that lists all the to-do items that I've got in my entire tree. And what it also means is, because there is nothing in this particular to-do record entry, I can see that I haven't got any outstanding to-do items for this individual. And the reason why it's quite useful is when I might be just looking up some records or researching a particular family history name or something, if I click on that person, I can instantly see whether I've already identified. So if I can see that I'm missing certain records, I can say, oh, I've already got a to-do item for that, I just haven't got around to doing it yet. Right, the next one is what I've called occupation (S), occupations. So this is not the standard GEDCOM occupation tag. I use that to record each individual occupation. But what I've used this for is, this is just a text thing, it doesn't have any dates associated with it, but it allows me to list all the occupations that that individual undertook during their life. The reason why it's useful is because I can see, and I list them in chronological order, I can then instantly see all the occupations associated with that person. If I'm then looking for other records, say it's the baptism of a child, and unfortunately you find that there's two couples that have got the same name, two John and Mary Smiths, having children around about the same time. Some records, like baptism records for example, may give the father's occupation. So it means if you've got potential confusion between two couples and whose child do they belong to, if you can compare the father's occupation with that single line, so you don't have to go off running reports on occupations, you don't have to keep pressing other tabs, just log into that, it gives you an indication. You can say, oh right, this one was a hairdresser and this one was a postman, and you can have a look and say, ah, my one was a postman. Not totally conclusive, you still need to do more research before you, but it just gives you an indication without having to look at another tab, which I'll show you in a moment, called the facts tab, which just gives you a list of all the information you know about that person, of which there'll be a number of occupation entries associated, probably with censuses and things. And it means if you're saying this person was a hairdresser, this person was a postman, and you have to go and look at that list of facts, you then have to go down and say, well, occupation 1841, no, occupation 51, no. Here it just gives me that information in one line. It's also useful for when I come to write the family history, because I can see instantly what occupations the person had and see if there's any particularly interesting or unusual occupations, which I think, oh, I'll mention that in the family history. So it's a lot of these things I'm showing you are just little things that I can put on the property box, which I just find are little things that help me when I'm trying to look up records without having to run reports or look at other tabs or work my way down lists of facts. The next one is will. I've only mentioned that, I think I previously mentioned that I record the date of the will rather than the date when the will was read, so it was the date the will was created. But again, by including that, when I'm looking down the list of information that I've got on that individual, I can immediately see in this example that that will entry has got an entry in it. It's not blank. So I can deduce I've got a will for this person. So again, when I come to write the family history, I'll think, oh right, I've got a will for them. I must make sure I reread the will and see if there's any information in there I want to include in the family history. Right, the next one is estate value, and that is another one of my custom facts. And this is where I mentioned in a previous section about the National Probate Register, a calendar of wills it's called, which gives you various information just in the index, and one of those is the estate value. And again, this is useful not so much for researching your family history, but certainly for when you come to write it up, is there's a number of websites out there which will attempt to give a equivalent value today based on a value at a certain time in the past. Now, you have to be careful with this, because they have to do it in different terms of how does it compare to house prices. So how rich was that person in those days compared to how many houses they could have bought compared to today. It's how much purchasing power you've got. It's how much is it equivalent in terms of how earnings have changed. And depending on which one of those you choose, you can get different answers. So what I tend to do is take an average of those. But it's still very interesting, because it gives you some idea of, was the amount of money here, was it £4,000 or something back in that year, quite a lot of money or not? And it gives you some indication of how affluent or otherwise your ancestor was at the time they died. So the next one is military service. Now again, I use the standard GEDCOM tags for entry information. And if you looked on the facts page, if there was any military information, there isn't for this individual. Again, you can instantly see there isn't, because there's a gap. I would use the standard tags and list all the different facts about his military service. But here, again, I use it as a summary. So the purpose of these two is just to remind me, or indicate to me, was there any military service associated with this person? So either there wasn't, or I haven't been able to find any. Okay, but again, it's there, so I can instantly see. The next one is a note entry, which I think is a standard GEDCOM thing, or it's certainly something that's provided by Family Historian. But again, why it's useful, what I put in there is anything which is, pardon the pun, of note, i.e. something exceptional. So it might be, in this case, the person had the freedom of the City of London. So again, I'm using this primarily for when I'm coming to write my family history. But what I want to do is put in there something that reminds me, oh yes, this person had something quite extraordinary compared to most people. Most of us, most of our ancestors will be born, married and died, had children, you know their census information, and you might know their occupations and things, but it's all fairly standard stuff. Whereas some of our ancestors, and they're the ones that are particularly interesting to write about, are ones that something different happened to them. Maybe they were a Freemason, maybe they were a freedom of the City of London, maybe they emigrated, maybe they served time in prison. I've got one who was a Titanic survivor, so I've definitely put that in there. And again, it's just a note, so that when I come to look at this individual, particularly when I come to write them up in the family history, I can easily remember, oh yes, Titanic survivor, oh yes, they went to prison. And it's something I must, it reminds me to write about this individual, because that's something quite unusual and something that I'm sure people would enjoy reading about. Okay, so the next group is I've tried to capture as much address information about where people lived as possible, and in addition to say on a death certificate it says you died in such and such a hospital, that's not where the person was living when they died. They would have been living in a house somewhere, fell ill, went to hospital and died. But if you don't include these additional things that I've included, all you'd have is death, such and such a year, in such and such a hospital. Or indeed, if it was just a place, you'd just say in Paddington or something. Okay, you wouldn't necessarily have a record of where they lived. So, say with baptisms, quite often it will say baptised in a particular church or something. Whereas obviously they weren't living in the church, they were living somewhere else. So if you know the additional information, that's why I put it. And it's so I can get as much information about where people lived. And the reason why is sometimes people make the wrong assumption that if a family were living in the same place for say 1851 and 1861 census, and then they seem to have moved in 1871 and then onwards to another place, but they only lived in two places. What you might find is between the two censuses where you've noticed that they've moved, you might find there was a baptism record in the middle where they were in a third location. But you wouldn't know that if you didn't record that detail somewhere. So again, I've recorded that so I can instantly see a long list of all the places they lived. So again, how does this help with family history research? If you're looking for a number of baptisms for children, and again if it's a common name and there's quite a few people in that area, you can use this information to say, oh, there's one to John and Mary Smith. Where were they living? Such and such. Oh yes, that's where the father was living at the time that some event happened or something. So it's just additional information, and it helps also when you come to write up the family tree, particularly if you're interested in plotting where people lived, and I'll come on to that in a later section. The next group is censuses, and this is probably the bit that's helped me more than anything. Okay, what you'll see is I've defined custom facts for all of the censuses, 1841 down to 1921 and the 1939 National Identity Register. I've also added a couple there for our lucky American cousins who have already got access to the 1930 and 1940 US censuses. But the reason I've done that is going back to my tale at the beginning of this session about how I used to produce a table with the various people and then all the different years, and I could use a cross and a tick and a question mark or a blank. This is how I've managed to reproduce it within my family history software. So what you'll notice is I've got, if you just scan down the date column, don't worry about the entries in there and what they say, I'll come on to those later. But if you just scan, you've got a pictorial view there where I can almost instantly see, without having to really almost think about it, and certainly without having to run reports or go to other tags, I can instantly see that with the exception of the 1921 census, I've got all the entries, or there is at least an entry for each of them. I'll come on to how we interpret the entries in a moment. But I can instantly see pictorially, I've got all the censuses except 1921. That's not surprising because here in the UK we don't get access to the 1921 census for 100 years, which means it will be next year 2022. Okay, but I can see I haven't got the 1921 census. So I know when the 1921 census becomes available, I need to fill that entry for this individual. Okay, this has helped me more than anything, because it means whenever I'm trying to think what information have I got about an individual and I click on this, I can instantly see for the censuses where there's gaps or whether I've looked at everything I can. Next is emigrated and immigrated. So again, these are my own tags that I've created, my own custom facts. Again, I do use the standard GEDCOM facts when there are actual facts for me to record, and again you'll see that if you looked on the facts tab, which we'll do in a minute, you'll see just a long list of all the facts I've got for that person. But again, this is a summary. This is just to let me know, have I got any records to do with immigration, and I can just put in there, went to Australia or whatever. And again, it's just so I can look, I can instantly see here, for this individual, because it's blank, and I know this because it's my grandfather, they didn't emigrate. But for other people, there will be a record in there, and again, it gives you an overall picture. you can almost look down there now and see all the information that I've got about that individual. And I can almost tell you the person's life story just by looking at the property box. Okay, I'll go through the whole thing in a summary in a second. If you go right to the bottom, you'll see that there's the entry where there's the marriage information, so you can see you married Emily. I wanted to mention the marriage date field because you can use a date phrase. I'll come on to date phrases in a moment, saying something like never married. So if you know, for example, someone definitely wasn't ever married, not you just haven't found a record for them, but you know for certain they never married. So if you've got a maiden aunt or a bachelor uncle or something and you know they never married, you can put never married in there. And the reason why that's useful is, okay, for you, you know that information. But if one day someone picks this up and runs with it and sees that it's blank, they then might waste time going looking for a marriage for your maiden aunt or bachelor uncle, and you know that there isn't one. So you could put something like never married in there. I'll show you examples of date phrases later. And then the final one is the note field down there. I personally use that to record children, and what I mean by that is not the actual children thing, but to record whether there were any children. So if I know for a fact that a couple didn't have any children, so for example in the 1911 census, is very useful on this. It's the only census, I don't know about the 1921 census because I haven't seen it yet, but up until now, the only census that was the 1911, which actually asked to list how many children were born and how many are still alive. So if you've got a couple in their 70s and they put down 0 children, then you know they definitely didn't have any children. So in that note field I put had no children. If, on the other hand, I don't know for certain a couple didn't have any children, but I've never been able to trace any, in all the census returns, and I've also looked at the General Register Office, birth index, and even searched by father and mother's maiden name, and I've never found any children, I'll use that field to say no children found. Not the same as saying didn't have any children, but no children found. And again, the reason for this, because remember this video is all about not wasting time, and it's being about efficient. If you put that comment in there, we've all got poor memories, especially when thousands of people are in your tree. You might go back to that a few months later and find that you haven't got any children for that couple, and you might think, oh, I wonder if they had any children, and go off in search and repeat all the searches that you've already done, whereas you could probably be spending your time more productively searching for other records that you've never searched for. Okay, so going back to the whole thing, you can almost, not quite, but almost begin to write the person's biography from this. So for this individual, I can see, just by looking down here, I can see he was born in a dairy in South London. I can see that he died in a hospital in Paddington. I can see where he was buried. I can see that he didn't serve in the military. I can see that he was a freedom of the City of London. I can see 1 or 2 other addresses where he lived during various things. Censuses, I can see that he also ran a pub, and it's got the name of the pub there. He didn't emigrate, he had children, and he was married. So quite a lot of information I've been able to glean there just from the way that I have laid things out, and because of the custom facts that I've created. Okay, so I've made reference to this other tab, the facts tab. What you've been looking at is the main tab on the property box, which is the one where you can configure what facts you want displayed, even if you haven't got them for that individual. I'm just going to show you the facts tab now, and as you can see with the facts tab, it's literally just a list of all the facts you've got. It doesn't list the ones you haven't got, so there's no blanks. It just lists every fact you know about that person. Okay, it's useful in its own way, and for any specialist fact that and by specialist I mean a fact that doesn't apply to many people at all in your family tree, you'll be able to see it there, because I probably wouldn't have displayed it on the main tab, because the main tab is really there for information which I think a significant number of people will have. If it's a really specific thing, I won't display it on the main property box, because you're going to end up with far too many facts, and most of the time it will be blank. So if you look down here, for example, there's one that's highlighted, which is about property purchase. I've only got that fact for a handful of people, and it's telling me when he bought the lease for the pub. There's also one or two others. This is sorted in chronological order, and if you go down to 1936, if you're able to locate that, it talks about hair and eye colour. Now, I got that information from a passport. I was lucky enough that my father kept his father's passport from quite a while ago, and I've was obviously in that information. It tells you information such as hair. Now, I haven't bothered including that on the main tag because for how many people will I know that information? Yeah, it's a rhetorical question. The answer is very few. Okay, so that's useful because that fact tag tells me every single fact that I know about this person, including ones that I weren't displaying on the main tab. However, to me, for want of a better expression, it doesn't speak to me. It doesn't instantly tell me what gaps I've got. It doesn't instantly tell me things that I still need to go away and find out about this person. You can deduce them, but you have to do some work. So, for example, in order to establish that I don't have the 1921 census entry for this person, which I happen to know because it hasn't come out yet, but you go through here and you say, oh, there's an entry for 1881, and oh, there's 1891, and there's one for the 1939 National Identity Register. Oh, so therefore I don't have 1921. In the same way that, do I have any military facts for this person? You've got to go all the way through and say, no. Do I have any occupational facts? You have to almost remember what facts you might be interested in finding out whether you've got them or not, then look. That doesn't help you with your research much. Going back to the main box, the main tab, I can instantly see, because of the way I've laid it out and the facts that I've chosen to include, I can see whether they've got a military entry, I can see if they emigrated, I can see what their occupations were. And believe me, when I look at that main tab, it makes me feel so much more confident I'm on top of it. It's almost like back to the old days of paper planning, where you had to produce tables and lists of the things you got, so you could instantly see where your gaps were. Here, I can click on any individual and see, do I still have gaps in the census information that I need to look for? Do I still have gaps in military? And believe me, it's improved the efficiency of my research no end. Okay, so that's the property box, and as I say, for me that's the single biggest thing in this whole video, which has really improved my confidence that I'm on top of all this, and at last the family history software is freeing up, finally letting me have the view of the data that I've always wanted, that I can look at that and instantly think I know what's going on. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about, we've already touched on it, but I'll go into more detail, is called date phrases. Okay, now date phrases, I'll show you a different example here. And again, what I like about the way I've laid things out is if we concentrate on the census returns, you can instantly see, without even having to do too much analysis, just look at the date entry, and you can see I've got an entry for every single year. I'll explain what they mean in a moment, but I can therefore deduce that I've either got all the facts that I need, or at least I've tried. So if you look at 1841 and 1851, you'll see in the date box it has the date 6th of June 1841, but it also then in brackets has not born. Now that is a date phrase. Now the important thing is, I forgot to mention that custom facts are part of GEDCOM. I'll say a little bit more about custom facts at the end under caveats, but they are part of the GEDCOM spec, custom facts. So are date phrases. So I'm not introducing anything here which is outside the GEDCOM spec. Date phrases are part of GEDCOM spec. And you can have different types of date phrases. You can have one which is literally just the text. I could have just put not born, and that would have been accepted by GEDCOM, but Because it wasn't associated with a date, it means when you come to sort chronologically your facts, it doesn't know where to put it, and it will probably just group it at the end. So what I do is I do an interpreted date. So what I do is I type in not born, so in this case, so I know that in 1841 and 1851 the individual wasn't born, so I don't even need to waste time looking for those census returns for that individual. But I've put in the dates of these censuses as interpreted dates. So I'm asking it for this particular fact. I put in not born and I want them to interpret it as the 6th of June 1841. It then means that when I start to list facts on the facts tab, I can sort them chronologically and the 1841 will still be in the right place. Okay, but it tells me instantly not born for the first two. I don't need to waste time looking for that individual in those censuses. Now I know you could say, well, you could deduce that from the birth date, but here, because I've got the 1841 and 1851 census continually on display, and I can see there's an entry in the date thing, I immediately know. I don't have to go looking and working it out. Do I still need to look at the 1841s for this person? Oh no, they weren't born. Here it just instantly tells me pictorially. If we go down the next two, 61 and 71, you can see I've got census entries. But for 1881, you'll see that I've got not found. Now, you could just leave it blank to say I've had a look and I couldn't find it. But this is the equivalent, if you remember I talked about when I used to do it in the days of paper, of having a question mark, which was I've looked for the record, but I can't find it. Okay, and this is what not found is. The reason I include it rather than just leave it blank is if I leave it blank, there might be the danger that one day I come back and think, oh, the 1881 census is blank. I'll go looking for it. And what the not found tells me is I've already spent quite a lot of time and effort looking for it, but I just can't find it. So I do have another custom query which I run where I can ask it to list all of the not found entries for everybody in my tree if I want to. But I know that I've already had a good look at that, and unless some completely new record set comes out, or one of the family history websites claims that it's got new information or something which they've recently discovered about the census or something for that year, I know that unless I really fancy a challenge and go back to it one day, which sometimes you do, I'd probably again be better not spending any more time on that. I've had a good look, I couldn't find it, so maybe go and look for some other records that I haven't yet located for other people. So that's what I've included. Next few 3 years, census years, again I've got the records, and then you'll notice for the last two, for 21 and 39, it says died. So again, obvious, but it's telling me you don't need to look for this individual in those censuses because they've died and you'd be wasting your time. Now again, you can deduce that from looking at the death date. But what this does is, looking at the date column again, you can see there's entries for every census. Okay, so I know I've either don't need to look for it because they're not born or they're dead, I've tried, there's a not found, or I've actually located the entries. But I can instantly see, and I can click on the next person and just by looking I can say, oh, don't need to do much, click, no, don't. Whereas if you had to go to the facts tab, which I showed you earlier, and say, right, for this person, what census returns have I got? I'd have to go again looking for 1851, 1861. Have I got 71? Oh no, I can't find 71. Yeah, this really, really speeds things up, and the combined use of custom facts laid out in a logical way with date phrases has made things so much more efficient. Okay, so that's custom facts and date phrases. The next thing I wanted to talk about is program-specific functionality. Now, what we're talking about here is that it's functionality which is provided by your particular family history software, but doesn't translate into something in the GEDCOM file. So I'm going to give you two examples. I mentioned I was a Family Tree Maker user in the past. The last time I used it a couple of years ago, they'd introduced kind of colour indicators, where you could say for a particular colour indicator, like a red one, you could allocate that for, say, uncertain match. So you've had some sort of lead from someone's tree, they've claimed that they've managed to trace some parents that you couldn't trace before. So you put them into your tree, but that's all you know about them, and you know you've got to do a lot more research before you're confident they do belong in your tree. And in Family Tree Maker it was quite useful. You could allocate, say, the red dot to uncertain match, and then you could allocate people that you were uncertain about with the red dot, and it would appear in the list of surnames, and you could sort by it and everything. But that functionality doesn't work its way into the GEDCOM file. There's no equivalent in GEDCOM. So when you export the GEDCOM file and import it into another piece of software, you won't see that red dot anymore, unless you export a Family Tree Maker file to someone who's got Family Tree Maker, then it will be. Okay. The reason I mention this, I'll talk about the program-specific functionality that I use in Family Historian, but the reason I mention this is because you need to be careful that you don't become too reliant, too dependent on functionality which is only provided by your particular piece of software and not part of the GEDCOM spec. So in the case of the red dot, if I become really used to using that and dependent on it, I would probably be reluctant to ever even consider moving to a different piece of software. Or that's how you use it. You export it to a friend or something, or upload it, and the functionality doesn't go with it. Okay, so it's just to be more aware. So it's always worth finding out when you're using a piece of Family History software, what things you're using which are part of the GEDCOM spec and which aren't, just to be aware. So I'm going to show you something in Family Historian which is quarter date. So I really like this. So anyone who's been researching UK family history will know that births, marriages and deaths are indexed from 1837 on a yearly basis, but each year is divided into quarters. Okay, and I've always never been quite certain how to enter that information into my family history program. Some people just put the year, some people put circa the year, on the understanding that their birth might be registered in the first quarter of a year, but they might have actually been born at the back end of the previous year. Because remember, these dates are registration dates, not the date the event took place. Other people will put between, so if it's quarter one, they'll put between January and March. If it's quarter four, between October and December. I've never really liked any of those. I mean, I don't think it makes much difference, but if you put something like between, you've got to remember that this is born between blah blah blah. In fact, the individual probably wasn't born between those dates. There's a good chance they were born in the previous quarter or something. But you're allowed, I think you're allowed 60 days, or was it 6 weeks or something, I can't remember, to register the birth. So I was never really quite, never really quite happy with how I could put dates in. Family Historian allows you to enter quarter dates, and I really like this. You can see, so was it birth quarter four of a particular year, and the death was it quarter one, I think. Yep. And because it's a quarter date, I instantly know, without even looking at the fact name, just by scanning down and seeing the quarter date, I instantly know it's a civil registration birth, marriage or death entry. I'm not aware of anything else which would have a quarter date like that. So I like that because it tells me something. It tells me this is a quarter date from a BMD index entry. It still suffers from the same problems in the sense that if you put birth quarter one, that's the date that the registration of the birth took place, and the person could still have been born in the back end of the year before. But at least I know, because it's a quarter date, I know we're talking about a birth, marriage and death entry here. We're not talking about any other type of source, because you could have born approximately 1896, could come from a census or from a baptism or from something else. Whereas when you see a quarter date, I instantly know that must be from a BMD index entry. So I really like that. However, it's not part of the GEDCOM standard. So when you actually look in the GEDCOM file to see what Family Historian has exported as, it's exported it as a between date. So if it's Q1 on my display, it will be between between January and March in the GEDCOM file. It's not a problem because between dates are part of the GEDCOM spec. But what it means is if you then import it into another program, they obviously won't display quarter dates. So I mention all this just to be careful that you don't become too dependent on program-specific functionality, which then either you're disappointed when it doesn't have it in another one, or you'll become so dependent on it that you're very reluctant to ever move program. For some people, they will be Family Tree Maker users for the rest of their life. There'll be Family Historian users. There'll be whatever. And I know everyone out there's got their favourite. But it's just something you need to be aware of. Right, so we're coming to the end of this section. I just want to talk about a few caveats. I've said that custom facts, I've shown you the custom facts, how very useful they are. I've defined one for every census return. So I could instantly get a picture of what census information I've got from an individual and which I still need to get. Custom facts are part of the GEDCOM standard, so we're not breaking any rules here. This custom facts are very much part of the GEDCOM standard. However, they have not in any way been consistently implemented. Indeed, one of the frustrations I have with the whole concept of GEDCOM is that there always seems to be a lag between the latest GEDCOM standard coming out and all the suites of family historian software and all the family history software, beg your pardon, and all the apps that you can get on your phone and your tablet. There all seems to be a lag before they've all caught up with the latest standard, even though quite often the latest standard is issued in draft form so that they can start preparing for the changes. And also within GEDCOM, GEDCOM tells you how you have to specify things in order for another program to understand it, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how that program should then display it and interpret it. So there's a lot of variation, and it means that you might be using your custom facts, which are part of GEDCOM, but when you export it to another program or an app, it should, if it truly is GEDCOM compliant, import them, but you're never quite sure where it's going to put them and how it's going to display them and where you need to go to look for them. So just be warned that, as I say, you're not breaking any rules because it's part of GEDCOM standard, but they have been inconsistently implemented. One last example is I use an app on my Android phone, which is a very good app. I'm very happy with it, but it claims to be fully GEDCOM 551 compliant, and it's not. I noticed that it implemented custom events and custom attributes, but it's left off custom facts, which I think I'm right in saying was introduced in 551. I contacted the creator of the app, and he admitted, he said, yes, I've forgotten to do that. So we had some exchanges. He asked me why I would use custom facts and how I gave him a few examples, and he's now gone away to implement it. So the next thing is that plugins and apps are mostly designed to work with standard GEDCOM tags. So this is not surprising, because after all, how on earth do they know what custom facts you're going to create? Now, this hasn't been a problem for me, but it could be a problem for some users. If you are someone that uses plugins heavily, and so for example within Family Historian, there's a user group and they're very active and they produce some very good plugins, but not surprisingly they work on the standard GEDCOM tags, because after all they don't know you've created custom facts. And there's one or two that kind of either give summary information about the census records that census information that you've got, or they even help you type in your information into for census returns. They clearly won't work with your custom census facts because they don't even know they exist. Now, so it's just be something to be aware of. It hasn't caused me any problems. It probably won't cause most people any problems. But if you do use plugins a lot and they work on the fact that you're using standard tags, then it means those plugins won't be able to work. So for example, the one that helps, the one in Family Historian that lists a whole load of kind of summary information about censuses would find nothing in my family tree because I haven't used the standard census tab. So it's not a big issue, but something to be aware of. And then the last thing is just to be aware that sharing your GEDCOM file with others could cause issues. Again, because custom facts and date phrases and everything are part of the GEDCOM spec, as long as their programs are GEDCOM compliant, they will import the data. But when I say it might cause problems, there is a lot of variation on what they will then do with them and where they will store the facts and how they will treat them. There's some software which even converts custom facts just to notes. So you've still got the information, but it doesn't even store them as facts. That's unusual. Most of the well-known, established family history programs will import them more as custom facts rather than notes. But what it means is, in my case, I've got a screen, so I've got all my custom facts and everything on it. Someone else sharing their GEDCOM file with me won't have all those custom facts, so the screen will just be blank. I'll have to go to the facts tag to see all the list of their census returns and everything. So it's not a problem, I can still access the information, but the way I've laid out my nice main tab to include all these custom facts, those custom facts won't exist in the other person's tree file, so it will just be all blanks. But I'll have to go to the facts tab and then I'll be able to see all the facts anyway. So it's just to be aware that it's not going to cause problems, but sometimes you will have to kind of dig a little deeper to find their information, or they'll have to dig a little deeper to find your custom tags. Okay, right, so that's it for this section. So in summary, we've looked at, this is all about laying out and customizing your family history software, whichever one you use, to bring to the front the information that you most commonly use in a form that makes sense to you. And for me, it was being able to see every census. Because if you use the standard census tab, you can only have one record, and it has to be your preferred one. It will just say census, whatever preferred tab, and you still have to go looking elsewhere for all the others. So for me, it was defining all the census tabs. It was defining an occupation summary tab. It was defining a summary about military service and immigration, and making a note of key things that happened in their life, like they survived the Titanic. It was trying to put as much information on that main tab that I didn't have to keep going looking for it elsewhere, and so that I could pictorially see, oh, there's a gap there, so I haven't chased that record, there's a gap there, which you don't get from the standard list of facts. Okay, so how did I achieve that? So it was by producing custom facts, for example the census ones, using date phrases such as not born, not found, dead, in the case of marriages, never married, and also a warning about using program specific functionality, where if you start to rely on it too much, don't forget that that functionality probably doesn't exist in other programs. And if you were ever to move, and give you an example of where you might want to move, there have been more than one cases where family history software has stopped being made. I think the Master Genealogist, has stopped now. I think there's been one or two others. So if one day you're forced to move and you've become very dependent on program specific functionality, you might be disappointed. Okay, so that's the end of this section. The next section is all about how I handle locations. So this section is called Locations, and it's all about how I have handled locations, people call places and addresses, and why the way I've done it has benefited me both in terms of researching my family history, but also especially when it comes to writing the family history. So to explain what I mean, here's an example of a typical entry which was done the way according to GEDCOM. So you'll see that there's an address from a census in 1891 in this case, and it has a place which is Thornton Heath, Surrey, England, and it has what they call an address, which is 12 Spa Road. So GEDCOM separates the place from the address, and it does that for a very good reason, because all the family history software tries to geocode the place names. So what that means is they try to work out where they physically are so they can plot them on a map, because most family history software I've seen has a mapping function where it can take all the places that you've entered and then plot them on a map for you. Whilst it can locate a place like Thornton Heath, it has no idea where 12 Spa Road is, because indeed Spa Road might not even exist anymore, or even if it does, it might have changed its name. So consequently, GEDCOM says you have a place which is geocodable, and then an address which gives you the specific location your ancestor was living in, but they've no idea where that is, which is perfectly reasonable. However, what I like to do in this example is I like to combine the address and the place into one entry, and for purely terminology purposes of this video, I'm going to refer to that as a location. I've no idea if that's the right terminology, but what I'm trying to do is differentiate between the GEDCOM place field, which just gives you the town or the village, the address field, which gives you the specific address, a street name and a number, and what I call location, which is where I combine them both. Now you might think, why do I want to do that? Well, I find it really interesting when I'm researching the family history. When I come across an address, I want to actually try and find out where in a particular town or village they live, what the actual address. I want to find out where the street is, because I don't find it very satisfactory just to say that my ancestors lived in Liverpool. I want to know what area of Liverpool, and I'd like to see the street. If possible, if there's street directories, you can even have a pretty good guess at locating where the house was, or at least maybe in a particular part of which part of the street it was in. Now, I like to do this for a number of reasons, but one is particularly when I come to write the family history, if I know exactly where the person lived, I can then do some research about that area and find out whether that particular street, this is easier to do in cities and large towns than villages, I admit, but find out whether that particular street, what sort of reputation it had. Was it in a kind of a fairly affluent area of the town? Was it in a fairly poor, really rough area of the town? What was it? And then, as I work out where people moved over the years from different addresses, you can ascertain things like, did their luck change? Did they go from a fairly poor area to a better off area? Or conversely, did they fall on hard times, started off well and then seemed to go down? Whereas if all you know is that they lived in Liverpool or lived in Manchester, that doesn't really tell you anything about them. Okay, so I like to combine it into one location. There is a downside. What it means is you now have to manually geocode your addresses, your locations rather, because when the software tries to do it, it will just come up with an error saying, I have no idea where 12 Spa Road is. I've even seen the software get confused. So if they were living in 11 Warwick Avenue, London, it would try and geocode it as Warwick, as in Warwickshire. So the downside is you lose the functionality of the geocoding, the auto-geocoding, if you do it this way. So it's a bit of extra work, but I'm going to show you throughout this section the reasons why I think it's worth the effort. Okay, so if we go back to something you've seen in the previous section, which is the property box for my grandfather. If you look just at the address, well, what would be the place field, but what I call location, I'm just indicating it now, you can immediately see that some of you who are eagle-eyed may have spotted this from earlier sections. You can see that I've combined the address and the place to give the full location. I like it because scanning down there, I can instantly see that my grandfather was born in a dairy. I can see he died in a particular hospital. I can see the cemetery he was buried in. I can see that he ran a pub. I can see all that just from looking at the location data. But because I've had to manually geocode those, I'll show you how I did the manual geocoding later. If you now plot all those addresses, all those locations that I've manually geocoded using the family historian functionality, but I know very similar functionality is available in all family history software. This is what it plots. Okay. Now, just to say, it doesn't put the circles round. I've put the circles round. Like most software, it plots like pins showing you, but I didn't think you'd be able to see them very clearly, so I've put circles round them. Okay, you can see if you go about 3/4 of the way up, you can just about make out the River Thames, and you can see there's one circle above, which was St Mary's Hospital, Paddington, where he died, and all the rest are south of the river. You can see there's a kind of cluster in the middle, which is from where he was born in Norwood and went down to Thornton Heath and then was buried in Croydon. And then down in the left-hand corner is Cheam, where he ran the pub. Now, you'll notice that one of the circles I've coloured red. And that's because this is the example of the difference between using just place and using location like I do. That's Thornton Heath. And there's actually he had 3 different addresses in Thornton Heath. Okay. If we now zoom in, so we're now zooming into the contents of that red circle. So if we now zoom in, what you can now see is 3 different addresses. Okay, again, I've put them in circles for visibility. It doesn't normally plot the circles, but you can now zoom right into street level, and you can see that he actually lived in the northernmost first. Then I know he moved down to the south one, and then he spent the last days of his life in the middle, where he ran his business from. But I can now see exactly the streets where he moved. I happen to know exactly the house numbers, so that's why they're the very exact plot. Sometimes if it's just a street, I'll just plot the centre of the street if I don't know anything better. So I've talked about manually geocoding it, so you might be thinking, well, how did you actually go about doing that? So if you look at this example, you'll see it's a typical entry from the 1891 census. It's got the date of the census, and it's got an address of 11 Leybourne Road, Kentish Town, Middlesex, an area I don't particularly know that well. And when I tried to look on Google Maps and search for Leybourne Road, Kentish Town, couldn't find it. It doesn't exist on a modern map. So then you're in the situation where you then have to try and work out, well, where was this road if it's not available on a modern map? So the first thing I do when I'm doing my investigations looking for a place is to say, is the address, is the event rather, within the period covered by censuses? So if it's pre-1841, you have to do something else, and if it's post-1911, you have to do something else, although the more modern, the more likely it is to still be on a modern map. In this case, we're in luck. This is an 1891 census address. So if you go back to the census, this particular census record, so if you've got a link, you can just click on it nicely, or if you haven't, just find it again on your chosen website. Bring up that particular entry, and if you're on Ancestry, for example, I can't remember if the other websites do this, they probably do, but Ancestry is particularly good because at the bottom it will say image 12 or whatever. Go into that box and type 1, and what you're trying to do is look at the very first image in that image set, because I don't know if you're aware, but the very first image is a description of the enumeration district. So every enumerator, before they started, would say this particular set of records is for the following area, and they quite often list streets and things. So I'll show you what page 1 is like for this example. So if you went to this particular census and went to page 1, this is what you would find. And as you can see, it's just a very brief description, and they've listed the streets covered. Now what I do is go through each of those streets and see if they're still existing today on a modern map. And what I found, and I've highlighted it in red, I'm looking for Leybourne Road, but there was also a Leybourne Street in 1891. So I thought, my guess is they're going to be quite close. So I looked up Leybourne Street, and that does still exist today. So once you've found one of the roads that still exists today, then you're in business. If you're unlucky and you go through all of them and you can't find any of them, you'll probably find one or two of them do exist, but they may have changed their name. Now there are some really helpful websites that you can just search for things like, if you just type in London Street, old London street names or something, there are one or two websites which will come up, and they have an alphabetical listing of the old street name and the new, and you can find out whether any of those streets on that page have changed their name. Normally, you'll be very unlucky if you can't find that. Normally you'll eventually find one of those streets, maybe under a different name, but on a modern map. Once you've found it on a modern map, you're in business. You can then, by going to websites with old maps, and I'll tell you about a really good one soon, bring up the modern map, which you now know where the nearby street is, bring up the old map, and then try and see if you can see on the old map where the other street is you've located, and then see if you can find the street you're actually looking for nearby. I actually have a subscription to the Genealogist website, and one function there they have which is really helpful is called Map Explorer. And what that allows you to do is overlay maps, different types of maps from different eras. And with a modern map, so if you manage to find the street on the modern map, you can, and I'll show you now, this is what it would look like. And as you can see, I've on the modern map, so this is actually the Map Explorer screen. On the modern map you can see I've put a kind of oval round where Leybourne Street is. So that's the one we managed to find on the modern map. We're looking for Leybourne Road. And what Map Explorer allows you to do is overlay that with an old map, I think from the late 1800s. And then by using the slider, can you see in the top left, I've put in a red box, there's a slider, you can then fade between the old map and the new map. And it means if you keep your eyes on the area you're looking for and you operate with it, you can immediately see on the old map exactly where that street was. So I'll just demonstrate that to you just by fading in. So we're currently on the modern map, and now we're going to fade to the old, fade back to the new, and now I'm going to fade to the old again. So now I'm happy I found it. I'll now highlight on the old map. Okay, so we're now looking at the old map. I'll highlight on the old map the street that we found, Leybourne Street. Now you can start looking nearby for the other streets, and lo and behold, and I'll highlight it now, there's Leybourne Road, which is the one we're looking for, and it's just literally a block away. So what I then do is I take a snapshot of the old map from the screen, and I edit it so that I get a nicely highlighted version of the street I'm actually looking for, in this case Leybourne Road, and this is what that looks like. And that's what I'm now going to include in my source record. Okay, so I've now located the road of interest on both the old and new map. Okay, so what I now want to do is put those details into a place record in my family history software. So this is what the place details entry form looks like for Family Historian. Again, there will be a very similar one for whatever your software of choice is. You can see it's got the address, so I've obviously typed in the census entry and it now knows that location, and now I'm in the process of manually geocoding it, so it's already got the address in there. The next thing you'll notice is there's a note box. That's freeform, you can type anything you like in, but I've put in there no longer exists, and that's just to remind me that if ever I'm going back to look for 11 Leybourne Road, there's no point looking on a modern map because that road no longer exists. You'll also see I'm being extra cautious here. I've actually, once I worked out what the latitude and longitude was, and I'll show you that in a second, I also copy that into the note box, just in case one day I accidentally switch on auto geocoding again and it wipes over the lat and I'm going to have to do it again. So that's just a safety measure I put in. So then we come down to the actual latitude and longitudinal box. So this is just way family history stores. I think other software might do it differently, but this is lat and long. I think lat and long is in the JED comic spec. So how do I work out the latitude and longitude? So what I do is, again, you can bring up the old map, which you've now located the road, and go, with your modern map, and try and work out whereabouts on the modern map the road that no longer exists would have been. I go back to Map Explorer on Genealogist and just go like that, and then I've got a pretty good idea on a modern map where the old road would have been. Then I go to Google Maps, and on the same location on the modern map I click it, and if you right click on Google Maps, so you can see here, if you've clicked on it, you clicked on the location, you've worked out where the location is, clicked, you right click and you get this menu come up, and what you'll notice is at the top is the latitude and longitude of that location. And what I really like, thank you Google, is you don't have to then note that down and type it in. If you click on it, left click on it, it automatically copies it to your clipboard. So once you've got that, you now return, so we now return to the source, the place entry box, and I just cut and paste that latitude and longitude into the box. Okay. The final thing I do is, I showed you earlier that I took a screenshot of the old map and then neatly highlighted where the road was. I then include that as a media for that record. So it means from now on, if ever I want to know the details of 11 Leybourne Road, I know not only the modern reference, and I can click on the online map button there, and it will take me to the modern equivalent of where it is, so you can see that. But also I've got the old map showing me exactly where it was, and I've got a note saying it no longer exists as a modern road. So it's pretty much everything I need to know about it. So before I go on to tell you more why I think it's worth doing all this, I'll give you some more examples. I mentioned earlier this excellent website for old maps, and it's the National Library of Scotland website. I don't know if you're aware of it. Don't be put off by the fact it says National Library of Scotland. It doesn't just cover Scotland. Some of the records are Scotland only. What I wanted to bring your attention to was the top two boxes, which one's called Map Finder with outlines. That is excellent. You go there and you can type in a place and it will find it, and it's for the whole of Britain. I think it's Scotland, England, Wales. I don't think it covers Northern Ireland, unfortunately, but it's for the whole of Britain. And these are highly detailed maps, right the way down to street level, and you can even see buildings and churches and things. They're excellent, and I haven't gone to the really remote areas, but for all the towns and cities and most of the villages I've looked at, they're very detailed maps. It's an excellent resource. The other one is the Explore Georeferenced Maps, and that, if you haven't got something like access to the genealogist and everything, or you don't want to go straight to census records and look at that first page and see what the description of the enumeration district is with all the streets. This allows you to type in a street name from either today or from the late 1800s. They've actually indexed it all. It's excellent. And I found that Leybourne Road, the one we've been looking for, is actually indexed in their late Victorian index. So I could have gone straight to that. So there's an example where you could have gone straight to it. The reason I don't always do that is because in the example I gave, which was 12 Spa Road, if you remember one of the early addresses, which is 12 Spa Road, that road has actually changed its name 3 times to my knowledge. In the early 1800s it was called Leather Bottle Lane. Then in the late 1800s it became Spa Road, as you've seen. And then sometime in the 20th century it changed its name to Northwood Road. So and I know that when I went to the National Library of Scotland, whilst it had Spa Road, it obviously didn't have Leather Bottle Lane. So it's very useful, particularly for late Victorian road names, but it's not a catch-all. I still quite often have to use the census and go back to the first page of the census. But it's an excellent website, and if you haven't discovered it yet, do so. It's very, very good. So now, why is it all worth doing? So I want to show you an example of a property box again, And this time what I've done is I've highlighted just the places. So if we hadn't typed in the address portion first, you'll see I've highlighted in 3 different colours to represent, so you can see how many occurrences of each address there are. But there's Shoreditch, there's Bethnal Green, and there's Mile End Old Town. So even though there's lots of different addresses there, there's actually only 3 places. Okay, and if we were to just plot the places, this is what we would end up with. So you see it's a map of the East End of London, Shoreditch over on the left, then you've got Bethnal Green further up on the right, and then Mile End Old Town further down. But that's all you get. Even though my ancestor, this particular ancestor, moved, I can tell you, about 10 times to my knowledge, around the area of East London, if you only plotted the places he lived in, it just looks like it was those 3. Whereas, because I've manually geolocated all the locations, i.e. the places and the address combined, this is what I was able to plot, and I included this in one chapter of my family history for this particular person, and this is what it looks like. And as you can see, much more detailed. And I've been able to show different dates when I first located that person at that address. You'll see some of them are birth dates and death dates, some of them clearly census dates, 1871, 1841. But I'm able to see how he migrated from one place to another until he ended up. Now you might say, yes, that's all very pretty, Gary, but what's it actually telling you? Now there's Charles Booth's poverty map, which I don't know if you know, but if you are fortunate enough to have London ancestors who were mostly inner London, it's quite expansive, but it doesn't go right the way to what today we would call Greater London by any means. But it was, Charles Booth did this survey of London in the late 1800s. I think it took him about 20 years or so. And what he was trying to do was, for each street, he was trying to map whether it was a very poor, run-down area, whether it was a modestly poor, whether it was modestly well off or very well off, and it was trying to give you an idea of what each street was like in terms of poverty. And because I've plotted down to street level, I've been able to look at Charles Booth's poverty map and get a pretty good idea for this individual how his life progressed. Did he start off modestly and then do well? Or was it the other way well? He started reasonably well and ended in poverty? Or were there ups and downs in his life? And again, the genealogist's map explorer, they include the Charles Booth poverty map, and again I can overlap and see immediately for each address that I've got, I can see, oh, it was a fairly affluent area, or it was quite poor, whatever. And it means when I come to write the family history, I'm able to put that narrative in as well and say, you know, he was born in 1822, this is just making it up off the top of my head, 1822, to a fairly modest background, but clearly he was a good businessman and he ended up a shop owner, and by the time he died he was in a much more affluent area. I say that's just, I'm just making this up. Or you can say, clearly life wasn't good to him because he had a number of setbacks, and here he moved to a much cheaper, rougher area, and then he did okay again, and then but it gives you some idea. If all you knew was that he went from Shoreditch to Bethnal Green to Mile End Old Town and back again, it doesn't really give you any idea of how his life went. Because I'm able to plot it down to street level and use Charles Booth's poverty map, I got a much better idea of how his life unfolded. Possibly other surveys have been conducted of other parts of the country and other cities, I'm not sure. But even if you don't have something as excellent as the Charles Booth poverty map, you probably can find out, so if it's Manchester or Liverpool, get some idea of the history by typing in something like what was Toxteth like in the 1850s, or what was Moss Side like in the 1840s or something, and get some idea of whether these areas have changed. And you might say, oh, this area today is considered quite a poor area, but in 1850 it was quite an affluent one, and you can still do a similar sort of analysis. So I really like that. I think it allows me to do extra analysis that I couldn't do if I just mapped place names. Okay, The next thing I want to talk about is registration districts and how I handle those. So this is another website which is extremely helpful. It's Family Search, which everyone's heard of, but it's a specific thing called Family Search, and it's //map with 2 P's, and it's a snapshot from 1851 of what all the registration district areas looked like then and all the corresponding parishes. So it is only a snapshot from 1851. It doesn't show you how registration districts were there, sometimes disappeared, combined, changed their names, etc. But it's still very useful for mid-Victorian, certainly. And this is an example. I'm just showing you here what the website is so you can see it. But if you look at a particular example, so I'm just going to bring up again another example. So this is the case where the only information you know is a quarter date from births, marriages and deaths. And here's an example. So someone died in 1932, quarter 2, in the Barton upon Irwell registration district, which I have to admit is an area I wasn't even sure where it was until I've looked it up. I now realise it's a part of Manchester, the Manchester area. But if you then type in Barton upon Irwell in the Family Search Map website, it will come up with a parish of that name, but it will also say Civil Registration District. And if you click on the Civil Registration District, you get this diagram. And you can see it highlights, it colours in the Civil Registration District that you've selected, but it also shows you the adjacent registration districts. And when you zoom in, you can even see the names of all the parishes that comprise that registration district in 1851. Okay, this is really useful because particularly something like this area that I don't know very well. I've got a few ancestors who moved up there, but not many. It means that when you're looking for something like birth entries, and you see that there were 2 in Barton upon Irwell, and there was another one, I'm just looking for a neighbouring district, in Lee. Because it's an area I don't know, I might say, oh, there was 2 in Barton and there's 1 in Lee. I wonder if that's the same people. You can look at this map and instantly see that Lee, to the left, is adjacent registration district. And if they happen to be living in one of the parishes which was near the border with the adjacent civil registration district, you can imagine if they only moved, quarter mile down the road, they'd be in the neighbouring registration district, and then you can say, oh, there's every good chance that that might be the same family. But I find it really useful that if it's an area I don't know that well, something like East London I don't need to know because I know what the adjacent ones are, but if it's an area you're not particularly familiar with, having that map is really useful, and then when you're doing your research you can say, oh, it's moved from Barton upon Irwell to Lee, I wonder where Lee is, and you can look at this and say, oh, it's a neighbouring one, oh, that's promising. And also when you're looking at corresponding parish records for this family, you can see that, oh, Eccles, oh, they're in Eccles, where's that? Ah, that's part of the Barton upon Irwell registration district, so that makes sense. And then you might find that they've moved to the neighbouring parish, but it happens to be in the Lee registration district. You think that all makes sense, they just moved to the neighbouring parish. So it's really, really useful. So how do I store the information? How do I geocode a registration district? Now, in some ways you almost don't need to, because a registration district can be a really large area and you don't know exactly where in that large area the person lived. But I like to geocode it anyway so that I can quickly go and find. So next time I look at that record and think, where was Barton upon Irwell again? I can click on this and immediately, because I've geocoded it, it will take me to the part of the country along with the registration map, and I think, oh yes, it's there. Okay, I don't always necessarily include it on like migration maps and things. So the map I showed you earlier, where I plotted the person's movement about through East of London, I'd probably choose to deselect the registration district one because it's too vague. But I like to geocode it anyway, so that at least I can remind myself where it is. So how do I geocode it? So what I tend to do, so this gives you an idea of how vague the Latin long is for a registration district. I tend to bring up the registration district on a map and then look for somewhere which is approximately in the centre. Then I go to Google Maps and I then take the latitude and longitude for that. And as I say, I don't tend to plot these on maps, but it's just for my own memory to say, where was Barton upon Irwell district again? Oh yes, it's up there. Okay, and then in the same way as I did previously, I take a snapshot of the registration district from the map, and I include it in the source details. So if we bring up the source detail, the place detail box for a registration district, you can see it's got the registration district name. Again, I've got the latitude and longitude, and I've just told you how I get that. I've made a copy of it in case I accidentally overwrite it, and I've here again included a snapshot of the map in there. So again, I can click on online map to find out roughly where it is, to remind myself when I'm doing my research, and I can also click on that map and see much more detail about neighbouring parishes and everything. So that's coming towards the end of this section. There are some caveats that I need to bring to your attention though about what I've done in terms of locations and manual geocoding. Okay, unlike previous sections where I've said custom facts are a part of GEDCOM, where I've said date phrases are a part of GEDCOM, what I'm doing here goes against the GEDCOM standard, because they specifically have a place field which can be auto geocoded and the address field that can't, and I've combined the two. Okay, now it only goes against GEDCOM in terms of if you then export your GEDCOM file to another program, they will try and auto geocode those places and won't understand the place because you've included the address field. All it means is they will still import them, they will still import what they think is a place field, the text will still be there and it will still say it's census 1841 and it will have the entry. It's just that the mapping functionality won't work. Okay, so I say the first one, it could cause geocoding problems with other programs, and the second point I've just covered, which is it's still imported. Okay, but when you go to use the mapping functionality, it will just be a mess because most of the places will be marked as not recognised. So it stops you using the mapping functionality. Okay, and some software, okay, it's a mixed bag as usual. I've got an app on my Android phone which thankfully takes everything I give it, including all the latitudes and longitudes that I've manually geocoded, and happily takes those and plots them on a map. It doesn't attempt to geocode it itself. But I've tried exporting it, my data to other family history programs, and with some of them there's no way of saying to them, don't try and auto geocode, it's already been done for you. They try and do it all over again and they get in a real muddle and mark everything as I've no idea where this place is. Okay. The final thing is, I'll be honest, manual geocoding is quite labour intensive. You've seen the process I have to go through. It's one of those things that if you do it as you go along, so if you found a record, you've got an address, and at that point you go through the process that I talked about. So you've already located the census record, for example. It doesn't take too much effort to then go back to the first page, look for a few streets. Of course, the first thing you do is look to see whether the street that you're interested in is still existing in modern times, and if it is, you're okay. But otherwise, go back to page one, make a note of those things, those street names, go back to Google or something, type those in, hopefully find one, and then go through the process I talked about locating on a map, geocoding. You're probably talking 10-15 minutes for an address. But if you do it at the time, okay, it's not too much of an effort. You're quite happy you found a record. You then spend 10 or 15 minutes just typing all the details in, including the copy of the old map and everything. And once it's done, it's done. And I guarantee one day you'll look back on that and think, where was that again? And you'll be really pleased that you did all the geocoding, you get a copy of the map, you've done it all, brilliant. But it is time consuming. Like most things, it's you get more out the you put in, and it's easy to just say, I'll just put the places in and let the program geocode it for me automatically. But if you want to go down to the sort of level that I've gone down to and get the benefits that I've gone down to, then there is effort. I've said they're doing it retrospectively. If you've already got hundreds, if not thousands of addresses in your database, the thought of going back and doing this retrospectively will probably fill you with dread. What I've done is I've done it in batches, and I've found I've managed to manually geocode now all the locations in my database by doing about an hour a day for about a week. Now you can spread it out over much longer if you like. You can do 5 minutes a day over a year if you want. But it actually probably only took me a few hours, probably 8 to 10 hours over a course of a week or two, because I just blitzed it. But if you think I don't fancy that, you could do it either as you go along, or just do it in batches. Another problem is you can't have both. You can't have auto geocoding switched on, or you certainly can't in my family historian program. You can't have auto geocoding switched on but then manually geocode, because what it does is it then continually tries to geocode, and I find it overwrites my manual geocoding. So you have to switch auto geocoding off. That's not a problem. All the addresses that, and places that you've typed in, rather, all the places that you've typed in the past and that have automatically been geocoded, when you switch auto geocoding off, it doesn't clear the entries. Whatever it's geocoded stays there. So you don't lose anything. So by switching auto geocoding off, you won't suddenly lose all your location data. It will keep it. But what it means is from then on, you will have to manually geocode everything that you enter. So it still means you can plot everything on a map, but you'll only start to see the benefit of the manual geocoding down to street level for each entry that you've actually done there. All the others will plot quite happily the way they've always plotted, which is places. So the fact that you might not get round to actually geocoding them manually yourself for a while doesn't really matter. You're not losing anything. Okay, so that's the end of this section. So in summary, we talked about address plus place equals location. So I talked about what I meant by that, how I combined the GEDCOM place and address field into one, which I've called, for want of a better term, location, and what the advantages of those are in the fact that you can then plot down to street level and get much finer level of detail. And I showed you the example, I think, of my grandfather, where there's 3 different addresses in one particular area, Thornton Heath, and if you'd only plotted the places, you would have just got one pin somewhere, whereas I was able to go down to specific street level. Then I talked about finding locations. So it's all very well to say, just liberally go off and manually geocode, but what does that actually entail? And I talked about how you try and find a particular address on a modern map. If it exists, you're in business. If it doesn't, if it's within the census years, look at the first page of a census entry, and it will give you a list of other streets, and then you try and locate some of those or one of those on a modern map. Or if you can't, it's probably because some of the street names have changed, and you search for maybe a street change, name change over in a website, and then you locate that. And once you've located that, you can then bring up an old map, and I told you about the National Library of Scotland's excellent collection, compare it to the modern map, and then eventually find the street that you've managed to locate on the old map, and then look for the actual street you're trying to find on your map, and eventually you find it. I talked about how I then import all that data into my place entry. So I've got the street name, I've got the latitude and longitude. I sometimes put a note in about whether the street still exists. Sometimes it might be a church, you say it was destroyed during the war, or building still exists but it's no longer being used as a church or whatever. I then talk about how you actually get hold of the latitude and longitude value, and that's by going to Google Maps, finding on the modern map where the location of the old street was, clicking on it, right-clicking on it, it gives you the latitude and longitude, copy that into the record, and then I also imported the snippet of the old map with the street highlighted. Once you've done that, you've done the set. Then I talked about why is it worth doing all this effort, and I talked about the fact that I showed you an example that if you only plotted the places, you'd end up with just 3 pins like that. And I showed you for a particular ancestor who'd moved 10 times how I could plot exactly where they moved to, and using something like the Charles Booth poverty map, I was able to then show that you could then do some sort of narrative about that person's life, and whether life was good to them or life was hard to them, and they either improved their lot or things got worse for them. Then I talked about how I handle registration districts, and how the excellent Family Map website has a snapshot for 1851, and you can see exactly the extent of a registration district, what parishes it included, the neighbouring registration districts, and which parishes were included in those. And that then allowed me to manually geocode a registration district, not necessarily for inclusion in maps, but so at least I could remind myself where this place actually was. So then I talked about caveats. I talked about the fact that we're slightly breaking GEDCOM here, because GEDCOM has separate fields for place and address, for the very good reason that it can work out where the places are but not the addresses, and therefore if you combine the two, you're now going to cause all your software problems when it tries to automatically work out where that place was. So you now have to do it manually. Okay. The fact that the data will still be imported, but it will cause the mapping function not to work. And then finally, I said that manual geocoding does require some effort, but I think it's really, really worth it. Okay, so that's the end of this section. So the next section is more research aids. So welcome to this section. This is more research aids. Now, as its name implies, it was a kind of catch-all. It's to contain those things that didn't logically fit in any of the previous sections. And there's three things I want to go through, and they're all very useful, hence this kind of catch-all section. So the first thing I want to talk about is surname distribution, and why I have found that useful. Both in terms of conducting my family history research, but also in terms of when I've come to write up the family history. So what I'm going to show you is how you actually acquire surname distribution data, and the good news is you can do it free. Okay, I'm going to use the Genealogist website. Now, don't worry if you don't have a subscription. What I'm going to show you, you can actually access for free. I hope it stays that way after this video. Just to prove the point, I've actually got a subscription to the Genealogist, but I've deliberately logged off in order to produce this presentation. So you can see it will work for you even if you don't have a subscription. So what this is here, this I'm showing you here is the main page for the Genealogist. So if you just go to the Genealogist website, you'll get this main page. And what you'll see, if you can just about see, I've put a red box around the surname field, and I've already typed in the name Dines, D-I-N-E-S, which is the one I'm using for the example. And if you just press return, then you'll see this screen. So this is the main search results screen. You can see there's only over 25,000 matches. But I want to draw your attention to the left, where it shows you a list of all the record types, and it tells you whether it's found any matches for those particular record types. And I've drawn a box around the census area, and you can see it lists all the censuses. And if you click on 1841, okay, you'll see this panel. So what I've done here is I've trimmed it down. I haven't shown you the whole screen, I'm just showing you the bit that we've clicked on. And as you can see, for the 1841 census, it then lists all the counties, and again in numbers tells you how many matches it's found for each county. But again, what I want to do is show you at the top, I've drawn a red box where it says view results as a map. And if you click on that, this is what you'll see. And as you can see, it's a nice colourful map. It's got a scale across the bottom going from the fewest number of returns is in a kind of lime green, and then it goes through a yellow, through an orange, and then to go right the way through to a dark red. Armed with that knowledge, you can instantly see, and this is what I like about surname distribution maps, is you can instantly see that Essex, which is that area in red, has got by far the highest concentration of the named Dines for 1841. If you look for the next one, it's London, not surprisingly, but that's orange, so that's somewhere in the middle of the scale, and then you're going down to the yellows and the greens, which means there aren't many at all. So where this is useful is I can instantly see that if I'm researching the name Dines in the first half of the 1800s, then clearly the place to start is Essex. Okay, that's where you're going to find the vast majority. It's clearly an Essex name. Okay. If we do the same now for 1901, so we go back to the previous step, and instead of clicking on 1841, we click on 1901, you get this map. Now, again, you can see that Essex is still very much the county to go to, but if you look closely, you'll also see that London is now in red. Okay, and the next most populous is Kent. So now, if you're looking for this surname Dines in the second half of the 1800s, then by all means, yes, you still need to look at Essex, because that's where a large concentration are, but you also need to be aware of the fact that clearly quite a few people with that surname Dines moved to London. And to give you an illustration of that, if I give you the figures for 1841 and 1901, in 1841 in Essex there were 233 people with that name, and next down was London with 81. Whereas by 1901, Essex has gone up to 360, not surprising, population in general had increased over 60 years. But London had gone from 81 to 267. So clearly, by looking at both the map and the table, you see the table to the right gives you the actual figures. By looking at that, you can clearly see that between those 2 years, 60 years apart, it was predominantly an Essex name, and then it became Essex and London, and there's still quite a few in Kent. Kent's gone from 48 to 129. So, not surprisingly, there's a few names that Dines in Kent, because if you think about it, Essex and Kent are separated by the River Thames. You've only got to cross the Thames and you're in the neighbouring county. And Kent's got a lot of dockyards, it had coal mines and everything, so maybe a number of people went there looking for work. But clearly, what this tells me by looking at these 2 years is in the early 1800s, Dines is predominantly Essex. By 1901, it's still very much Essex, but also very much London and quite a lot in Kent. And this just helps me when I'm trying to look for records. Because you do get some people will say, oh Dines is an Essex name, I'm sure those people in London aren't mine. Whereas what this is clearly saying to you is they are. A lot of people with the surname Dines clearly migrated to London. Okay, so it really helps you concentrate on your where to concentrate your research on. The other thing I like about this, as you can see, the data is available as a table to the right of the map, and it allows you, if you want to copy and paste that into a spreadsheet and do further analysis with it. So, for example, I don't actually use the genealogies directly. I tend to copy and paste the data. I bought a program many years ago called GenMap, which it's a fairly simple program, but it does what it does very well. And it can do more than the simple map that Genealogist produces. But remember, the Genealogist is free, so it's an excellent starting point for many people, because it's free and it allows you to see quite a lot of the information already. But I like to copy the information into a spreadsheet and then import it into GenMap, where I can do more with it. So here's some examples of what I've done using GenMap. The first example is something you can still do using just the genealogist data, which is where I've got two variations of the same name for a particular year. So previously you've seen the same name, Dines, D-I-N-E-S, but for 2 years, 1841 to 1901. Here is the opposite, which is where for the same year you're comparing two variations of the same surname. As I say, you can do this with a genealogist, but what GenMap allows me to do, and what by copying and pasting the data into a spreadsheet allows me to do, if I wanted to, I could do a map where I'm combining 3 or 4 different spelling variations that I've come across for a particular surname. so that I get the picture of, for all the different variations I'm aware of, if you were to add all the data together, what would the map look like then? Because it's useful to do it for the separate surnames, to see if there's any kind of regional variation there. So in the case of the Coombs, you can see here with and without an E, it's very much if you've seen my video on how to write your family history, you'll probably remember this particular example. But it shows you that one variation was high concentration in Somerset, and the other variation was in the neighbouring Devon. So it's still clearly from that region, but it's interesting that the variations vary from county to county. But as I say, if I wanted to, I could have added the data for both those variations together to give me the one map. Okay, you couldn't have done that with a genealogist without manipulating the data and then importing it into something like GenMap. The second example is for the name Meisel, which is a Jewish name, and you can see it's a very unusual name. It's very rare. What you'll notice for that particular map is that how many counties are white, i.e. they have no occurrences of that particular surname at all. And if you look at this, this is for actually the National Identity Register. So I've extracted the data for the National Identity Register and imported it into GenMap. And what you can see here is that the numbers are not great. If you look at the actual numbers, it's probably difficult for you to see, but the highest concentrations are London, which is 27, and Lancashire, which is 24. So you're talking very small numbers for a very unusual surname. But I can immediately see that London and Lancashire is where I've got to look. There's only ones or twos elsewhere. So if I'm researching Meisel, it's London and Lancashire. So, but say there are other things you can do if you copy and paste the data, but then you need something like GenMap to put it in. But going back to the genealogist, for many people, it's an excellent starting point because you can get the data for free. It can certainly help you with knowing where in the country you want to concentrate your research because it's a particular regional name, and it can help you do that for all the different census years and everything. I like to include these sort of maps in my family history when I'm talking about how the family migrated over the years and how, for example, in the case of Meisel, why did people, I know, I've traced the history, they originally arrived from Eastern Europe, came into Ipswich for a short while, then moved to London, and then a few of them chanced their luck up in Manchester and Liverpool. And it's interesting to, by looking at these maps, is to say, I wonder why in 1841 there was a concentrationist name here, but 60 years later they'd all migrated up there. And you can start asking questions like what happened, and you find that maybe they were in a particular trade, which then kind of migrated to a different town or something. But all these things are just useful indicators of ideas where you can focus your research. Okay, so the next section is about possible matches. So what I mean by possible matches is sometimes you've got useful things like other people's family trees in Ancestry, for example, and you'll get a match, and when you click on it, you'll find that to your surprise they've managed to locate, or claim to have managed to locate, some parents that you've been looking for of an individual for years. But they seem to be very confident they found them, and indeed they go back another generation or two. So you think, this looks like a very promising lead. So you make a note of the two people's names and copy it into your family, or type it into your family tree. But at that point, it's just very much a possible, uncertain match. You really don't know if it's right or not. So what I want to do is actually somehow indicate that those two people I've just put into my tree are very much uncertain matches. Now, it surprises me, because Family Historian doesn't do it, and I don't think Family Tree Maker did it. It surprises me that family history software doesn't provide a very simple way of perhaps selecting an individual and right-clicking and just set it to uncertain match or possible match. And then the software can have some sort of visual thing. It can draw a box around the person. When you run a report, it can say uncertain or something. on a map, it can show on a diagram, it can somehow highlight it as uncertain. But I've yet to find a piece of family history software that does that. Family Historian recently was updated with some really excellent updates, but still doesn't. It allows you to put down whether a particular fact about an individual, whether you're certain or not, but it doesn't allow you to say whether that individual's uncertain, or at least I haven't found a way. So consequently, what I've done, and it's important because in case you forget one day that this is an uncertain match and you treat it as a certain one. So what I do, and it's not ideal, but it's the best thing I can think of, is you can see here, I've just created a little image which just basically says, you know, kind of possible match, question mark, and I've produced a blue one for men and a pink one for women just to differentiate. Probably not necessary actually thinking about it, you could just have the one. But as you can see on this diagram, it displays when I bring up the main page, it just displays these pictures, and I can clearly see, oh yes, they're an uncertain match. And I won't clear that picture away from them until I'm confident I've researched it enough and can say, yes, this definitely is a match. I'm just going to show you, I'm just going to highlight on the screen where all the little icons are, because you may not have seen for the children as well, there's very small uncertain matches which I've highlighted. But obviously when you click on them as individuals, you then get it as a big picture. And as I say, I do this, it's not ideal. I still haven't managed to come up with a better way of doing it. So if anyone's got any suggestions, I'm all ears. But I do want, because again I'm someone who's visual, I do want a visual representation, but something that when I bring up that individual, it immediately stares me in the face. This person is a possible match. Don't treat it as a definite match. Okay, so that's possible matches. And finally, I want to talk about source linking. Now, if you have seen section 2, which is about data storage, why you would want to download source files in particular to your PC. So if you've seen that section, then you'll know that I store away the actual image, census image or something, and the advantage of doing that is that you can edit it, you can make it more legible, and you can put a highlight showing where the record is. The disadvantage is that you haven't necessarily got a link back to the original record on whatever website you had. Okay, I say disadvantage because if ever you want to look at that record again, it means if you haven't got a link back to the original website, you've effectively got to start from scratch again, going to that website, typing in the person's name, typing in the census year, whatever, finding the record and eventually bringing the record up again. And you might want to look at it again because you might want to do a search either side. You've found out in a subsequent census that some other family that you didn't know was part of your family until recently was living in a nearby street, so you think, oh, I wonder if I can see them on a previous census. So you might want to quickly go back to that census and just to take a look at it again. You might want to go back to the census for the reasons I explained when I was looking for finding locations. So in the previous section, section 4 on locations, I said how I find old street names is to look at the first page of a census return, which gives you a description of the streets in the enumeration district. So there are a number of reasons why you might want to go back and revisit a record. So even though you've got a copy of that census record, you might want to go quickly back to where it was on the website, because you then either want to go back to the first image to find out the name of the streets, or you want to search records either side. Okay, so some functionality that was introduced in Family Historian recently, which I have to say is excellent. I don't know how I survived without it. Is it, and I'll show you here. So for this particular entry, you can see for the 1901 census, you've got this particular address, but the associated record for that, when I bring it up, you can see in there it has the source. So the source for this particular census was Ancestry. I've got the reference there for 1901, But you'll notice in the note section further down, I'm now able to copy and paste the web link directly into this citation. It's a really useful thing because it means I've now got the best of both worlds. I've got the downloaded image, which I've been able to enhance and highlight so I can locate things quickly. But if I ever reason want to go back and find where I got that image from, I've now got the embedded link in the notes section, and I can click on that and it instantly takes me back, all on the assumption of course that you've still got a subscription to that website. And what I'm showing you here, this is a made up example, because I don't go to this level of detail. It'd probably be good if I did, but I haven't. If you look in the notes section, I've actually got links to the transcription and the image for 4 different websites that I've subscribed to over the years. I think I've got Ancestry, Find My Past, The Genealogist and MyHeritage. And if you really wanted to future-proof yourself, if you like, that when you have a subscription to a particular website, if you cut and paste the link in, and I'll show you what to do if you don't have this family historian functionality of embedding web links directly. If you cut and paste those in, it means in future, if ever you want to go back and look at a record, but you now only have a subscription to say Find My Past, if you had all 4 of these, and as I say, this is made up, you could then click on the relevant one where you've still got a subscription. It's over the top. I don't tend to do that. I tend to just have the one link from the place that I found it. Okay. If you haven't got this functionality, i.e. you haven't got the ability to cut and paste a web link which you can immediately then click on, this is something that occurred to me. It's amazing it's never occurred to me before, but it just shows you how we live and learn. Whilst I was producing this video, it occurred to me, Gary, you fool, you could have been copying the web links in as just as a URL, just as the address. So if you look at this example, that's exactly what I've done here. I could have been doing that all these years and it hadn't occurred to me. It just shows you, doesn't it? That if you haven't got that functionality where you can copy the web linking and it immediately becomes a link that you can click on, there's actually no reason why when you're looking at, say, Ancestry or something, you can't just copy the URL and paste it here as text. So it's not a web link, it's text, as you can see. But what it means is if ever you want to revisit that record, you just copy that text, paste it into your web browser, press return, and again, as long as you've still got a subscription, you'll find the record. And it's amazing, for years, it hadn't occurred to me to do that. So I say, you're never too old to learn. So I don't need to do that because I'm now using Family Historian, which has got the ability to embed web links, which is an excellent addition. And the reason why this is so good, again, it looks like a minor thing, but it's really made a difference because I now really do have the best of both worlds. I can very quickly go back to a link if I want to explore any further, but I've also got the downloaded version which allows me to improve the readability of it, highlight where the record is so I can find it so much quicker, and also if I'm not currently subscribing to any websites, I can still see at least that return. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is the source record for it. If I now click on the Media tab, you'll see I've just got the one copy of the census return. So even though I've got the 4 links, you only need one copy. You only download one image, improve it, highlight it and everything. And indeed, if I just click on the little button highlighted there, it will bring the image up, and this is what the image looks like. I'm showing you this just as one more example. If you have seen section 2 about reasons why you might want to download your data to your PC, this is another example of how I've used highlighting, this time for a census return. And I've used highlighting, again this time, census returns, because they are lined and therefore nice and straight, lend themselves well to a box approach. As you can see, it's very subtle. I've put a pale grey box around the census area of interest. I do that because I don't want the highlighting to be too obtrusive. I don't want it to kind of dominate the record, but it needs to be sufficient that my eyes can still go to that record. So in this case, it's a simple pale grey box around the record, which allows me again to immediately go to the right thing. So it really is a best of both worlds, this approach. You've got the links back to the original records if you need to review them, and you've got the downloaded image which has been visually improved, straightened, and a nice highlight box around it so you can find the record really quickly each time you need to look at it. Okay, so that's the end of this section. So in summary, we looked at surname distribution data and how through the genealogist, it's free at the moment, you can, for a particular census year, I think it's also for the National Identity Register, but certainly for a particular census year, you can get a surname distribution map and the corresponding table with the data in it for a particular year for a particular surname. And that's really useful for two reasons. One is that when you're conducting your research, it gives you an idea of the areas to concentrate on. And it also allows you, when you come to write your family history, to give you some clues to say, the concentration of people were here and then they seem to migrate to there. I wonder why they did that migration, and you can do some background reading and it just helps to give you, again, some things that you might want to pursue. Then we talked about possible matches. This was a very simple thing, and it's really more to do with the fact that I can't find any family history software that handles this properly. And that was where I just showed you, I put a small image in which just kind of, with the big words, possible match. And this was to make sure that you could still identify those people in your tree that are very much possible matches. You got the source from somewhere else, you copy them in, but you're really not confident that you've done enough research yet to say, yes, these people belong in my tree. And then finally, source linking, where I talked about the best of both worlds, where within Family Historian you can now embed web links back to a source. So if you ever need to revisit the source for whatever reason, you can do so just at a click. And then I said, it occurred to me while doing this video that there's nothing to stop you actually just copying the URL and pasting it into the notes section, which all family history software's got, as a string of text, which you can then copy, paste back into your web browser and go back to the record anyway, assuming you've got a subscription. Okay, so we've now reached the end, and the next session is final thoughts. So this is the final section called Final Thoughts, which is where I'm going to bring together a summary of all the things that we've covered in the preceding sections. And it's just to remind you that the whole thrust of this video has been about things that I've been able to do over the years that have really helped me see the data that I've entered into my family history program and actually present it in a way that I feel it's really starting to help me with my research. So how have I done this? Well, this is the property box which you've seen a number of times now, and I think this is the crux of the matter. This is the thing which I think everything else hangs off. And if you can come up with your own configuration, your own way of working, where you can get as many details, as much data presented to you on your main page when you bring up your program, then the better, because it saves you having to run reports, it saves you having to run queries, it saves you having to click on various tabs to find out where the data is. And I've just found that the way I've done it, it's really helped me. Okay, so how have I done this? So custom facts, as you can see there down the left hand side, I've highlighted all the custom facts that I've produced. And the reason I've gone down the custom fact route is because if you just take the standard census fact, for an example, and put it on your main page, you can only include it the once, and you have to say what your preferred entry is. So you either have to have just the 1871 or just the 1881. You can't display them all. But through the use of custom facts, and you can see all the ones that I've produced for censuses, it means I can see all the census information on my main screen in one go. Okay, so I've also used, you can see there, date phrases. And the advantage of date phrases is it allows you to see instantly that you've considered that entry. So for a census, for example, you can put 1841, not born, so you know you don't have to worry about that census. If it's a later one and you put died, you know you don't have to worry about looking for them in that census. And if it's not found, you at least have an indication that you've tried your best to look for that record, and until now you've failed to find it. But you can just look at that list of census, for example, and instantly see I've got no gaps, or I've got a gap. This is the 1921, which I know I've got to fill anyway. Up the top I've talked about program specific. Here the examples were quarter dates, which is a functionality provided within the Family Historian software. But the main point of that section was to remind you, be careful about becoming too dependent on function specific, program specific functionality, because it means if ever for any reason you have to move, say the company no longer supports your product, and that's happened in the past, you move to a new piece of software and you're going to be disappointed that that functionality which you've used so many times isn't available. Then I talked about locations and how I prefer to be able to geocode locations right the way down to a specific address, hopefully at least the street, if not the house itself. And I talked about in example 2, but window 2 here, you can see that's what you would get if you just plotted the places, because in this example there was 3 places: Shoreditch, Bethnal Green and Mile End Old Town, and that's all you'd get. I don't think it tells you a great deal. Whereas if you go down to the level of plotting individual addresses manually like I do, you can plot something like this, which shows you the 10 different, in this example, 10 different addresses that someone lived at. And the reason why this is useful, it's useful particularly when you come to write your family history, because you can then say so much more about the type of streets that the person moved into. What were their fortunes like? Over the years, did they move into more grand accommodations, so they were doing well? Over the years, did they move down because they were struggling? Or more likely, it was probably fluctuating circumstances. But plotting locations down to the individual location level, streets and things, you can glean so much more information. So then I went on to talking about locating streets that no longer exist, because clearly if you're now going to plot down to street level, one of the problems and the reason why you have GEDCOM places and addresses separate is because how are you supposed to work out where a street that no longer exists was? So I gave the example here of a street in Kentish Town, I think it was, called Leybourne Road, and we couldn't find it on a modern map. So if you go to window 2, you can see that's the first page of the equivalent census return for that year, which gives a description of the streets. I was able to find one of those streets on a modern map, which is window number 3, where I've highlighted it on the modern map. I then looked for it on an old map, in my case using the genealogist's Map Explorer, but you could use the excellent National Library of Scotland maps and put them side by side. You then find the street that you've located on the old map, and then you look for the street you're actually looking for on the old map. And then in window 5, you can see for the place data, I've then made a copy of the old map and highlighted the street, so I've got that for future reference. And in window 6, I told you how you use Google Maps to geocode the location on a modern map. So obviously the street's not on the modern map, but you can at least show where it would have been on a modern map. And then you can copy that back into window 5, and that's how you manually geocode. Then I did a similar thing for registration districts, because sometimes the only information you've got for a person is a birth, marriage or death index entry, which tends to talk about registration districts. So here I talked about Barton upon Irwell, which is a place I must admit I didn't really know, but you can look up this excellent, in window 2 you'll see it's the Family Search Map website, which is excellent, which shows you from 1851 all the registration districts and the neighbouring registration districts, and if you zoom in, all the parishes that comprise that registration district. And you can see once I found it, I take a snapshot, which is window 3, which then I can then include in the place data, which is window 4. So I've then got a copy of that map, so anytime I want to remind myself where it is, I can bring it up and see where the registration district is and the surrounding ones and the parishes. And I also again use Google Maps to geocode it. That's a little bit more woolly, because where do you geocode a large area for a registration district? I tend to just pick somewhere which is about geographically centre and geocode it. I don't tend to plot those on maps because they are so vague, and the person could be, if it's a very large registration district, the person could be anywhere in there. But I do geocode it, so at least I can remind myself on a modern map where it is. Then I talked about source record download and linking. So this is where I've got an example of a census return, and this is almost bookends as far as this video is concerned. I started in section 2 talking about the advantages of downloading records, because you can then edit them, remove any dead waste around the outside, dead areas around the outside. You can straighten it, you can improve the legibility by changing the contrast, and you can, most importantly I think, highlight the entry of interest so that you can find it much more quickly next time. And you can then store that away. But also, by the time I got to the penultimate section, I talked then about source linking, where it's advantageous to then actually also link back to the website where you got the record from, so you can very quickly go back to that if you need to. So in this example, you can see in window 1 we got an address and the source was Ancestry. In window 2 it shows you the citation window for that, and in the notes section you can see in blue all the web links. This is a bit of an artificial example because I don't normally put links to all 4 of the websites that I've had subscriptions to, but it's just an example. And then if you click on the citation, you can see I've included the downloaded version, which I've edited, and that's when you click on that, it shows you window 4, which is the actual census entry. And if you look closely, it's quite subtle. I put a pale grey box around the entry of interest. That's just so I can locate it without it obscuring any of the data. Then another couple of examples of why downloading your data is useful rather than just having the web links to it. On the left you can see the National Identity Register, and in the bottom left corner of that you can see that I've put a red bar. I've also improved the legibility of this by changing the contrast. But it means on a record like that, which has got lots of entries, you can go straight to it, and the red bar also gives you an idea of how big the household is. And then on the right, I think is even a better illustration, is of an old parish register from the early 1800s, where there's 2 entries of interest on there, but there's about 80 records on there, and having to go through them every time to find it is the nightmare. So I've just subtly highlighted, you can just about make out 2 of them are highlighted in light blue, and it just means that when you want to look at that record again, you bring it up and your eyes go straight to it, and it really does save you time. Then I went on to some specific things in the last section, surname distribution analysis, and why this is useful both in terms of researching your family history, but also when you come to write it up. So I talked about, for the moment, the genealogist website in window 1, that's the main page, and how you can access the surname distribution data free of charge currently. And if you type in a surname and press return, you get window 2, which is the search results window, and I've highlighted the census area on the left you can filter on. And when you filter on 1841 census, it comes up with pane 3, which gives you a list of all the counties for that census with the number of entries they found. And at the top it says display as a map, which gives you window 4, which you can see is a very colourful map, which immediately your eyes go to the dark red area to tell you this is a name predominantly, dying as this was, predominantly in the Essex area. And I've also highlighted to the right of that diagram the actual data with the number of records for each county, which I personally then use with another application called GenMap, where I can then plot surname comparisons, different years. I can add data together for different variations and print them on one map. I can do more with it, and that allows me to do the sorts of things I've got in number 5, which is where I do in this example, a side-by-side comparison for the same year of 2 different spellings, and that's an actual page from my family history document. And then finally, a few specific things. Top left is how I've handled possible matches. So this is where you've got the lead, you've put the name of the person in there, but you need to do an awful lot more investigation before you're confident that person truly belongs in your tree. And I personally have done this, where I've just created an icon which I put in, an image which I put in there, which clearly shows a big question mark and possible match. And the only reason I've done this is because I've yet to find any family history software, please let me know if you know some, that actually handles possible matches well. My own software, Family Historian, handles facts, where you can say whether you're certain about this fact or not, but not about the person. In the bottom left-hand corner is where I told you about how I've my file naming convention and how I've named my files. I'm sure many of you have already got your own file naming convention, but this was just for illustration purposes, just to demonstrate that you do need, if you're downloading files and if you've got lots of scanned images and things, you do need to come up with some file naming convention so you can store them away, so they have both their unique name but also a name that means something to you and you know what the record actually is. And then top right is where I talked about two typical ways of structuring your directories on your computer. I started with the bottom one years ago, which was having a directory for each surname. That got a bit unmanageable, so I moved to the top one, which is where I have a directory for each record type. But again, this is just what suited me. The real purpose of that section was to bring to your attention the needs, if you haven't already thought about this, the earlier you think about it, the better. Okay, so that's that, and hopefully that's given you an idea of all the things that I've done, which I've personally found have really helped me in my family history research. Particularly, I think the property box and use of custom facts and date phrases, they're the ones that I think have made the biggest difference. I'm sure when you've been watching this video, you have your own good ideas, and you've probably thought, well, I'll tell you what, Gary, I've done this as well, and this is something you might want to think about, and actually, yes, I've solved that problem. Then please, 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 if that's the case, do feel free to add comments to this video, to share them both with me and the wider community, because the reason I've produced this video is simply to try and help others. And the family history community really benefits from people helping each other. So by all means, if you've got any good tips, please add them as comments. I refer to a number of websites in this video, and at the end I'm just going to list a few if you want to take them down. I've also added a couple of extra ones that I use regularly that I didn't actually refer to in the video. If you're thinking of writing your family history, then I've done another video specifically on that, and I've actually well through writing my family history, and in there, unlike this video where I didn't tend to give feedback on the things that didn't work well, I just concentrated on the things that have worked well and I've continued doing. In my Writing Your Family History video, I talk about the things that worked well, but the things that I tried and sent off to people and they read them, but they came back and said they didn't enjoy it quite so much, or I could tell by their lack of comments, positive comments, they didn't enjoy it quite so well. So if you are thinking of writing your family history, please see that video. Okay, so that's it. So I really hope that you got some useful ideas out of this, and even if you're not going to copy the things that I've done, hopefully at least it's given you some ideas when watching the video of things that you can go away and do. Okay, so all it remains is to wish you the very best of luck with your family history research, and thank you for watching.